The wind in Cottonwood Springs did not blow so much as it scoured. It carried the grit of the high plains, a relentless, abrasive dust that found its way through the tightest window sashes and settled into the creases of skin and clothing. It was a late afternoon in autumn, the sun hanging low and bloody in the western sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the rutted main street. Nora Hayes walked against the wind, her head bowed, her chin tucked into the rough wool of her collar. She carried a wicker basket filled with dried linens, the weight of it pulling at her shoulders. But she did not slow her pace. To stop in the street was to invite attention, and attention was the one thing Nora could not afford. The town was little more than a scar on the landscape, a collection of false-fronted buildings that looked as if they might collapse if the wind pushed just a little harder. A freight wagon rattled past, the mules snorting in the dust, the driver cracking a long whip that sounded like a pistol shot. As Nora passed the front porch of the Lucky Ace Saloon, the laughter of men drifted out, sharp and crude. "Look at that," one voice said, low and suggestive. "Walks like she is afraid of the ground. She has reason to be," another voice answered, followed by the sound of tobacco juice hitting the boardwalk. "That is the Hayes girl. You know where she came from before she landed here." Nora tightened her grip on the basket. She fixed her eyes on the hem of her skirt, stained with the mud of the alley, and kept moving. She had learned long ago that deafness was a woman's best defense. If she did not hear them, she did not have to acknowledge the heat that rose in her cheeks, the shame that was not hers to carry but which had been draped over her like a heavy, suffocating quilt. She reached the back door of the boarding house, a 2-story clapboard structure that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and lye soap. This was her world now, not the silk and velvet of the parlor house in the city, where the air had been thick with cigar smoke and cheap perfume, but a kitchen where the grease hung in the air and the water was always scalding. She slipped inside, the sudden quiet of the scullery a relief from the wind. Mrs. Higgins, the proprietress, was nowhere to be seen, likely upstairs changing the sheets in room 4. Nora set the basket down and moved to the basin, plunging her hands into the water to scrub the dust from her skin. Her hands were red and chapped, the nails broken. They were the hands of a scullery maid, not a lady. She stared at them as the water turned brown, her mind drifting back to hands that were softer, shaking violently. Her father's hands. She could still see him in the dim light of that office in Denver, the smell of stale whiskey oozing from his pores. She remembered the scratch of the pen on paper, the way he refused to look her in the eye as he signed the paper that transferred his debt to the madam. He had sold his dignity years before. That night, he had sold his daughter to keep his kneecaps from being shattered by loan sharks. "I am sorry." "Nora," he had whispered, weeping into his hands. "It is only for a little while, just until I get a winning hand." He had died 3 weeks later, his heart giving out in a gutter, leaving her trapped in a room with red curtains and a lock on the door. She had run the night the madam died of consumption, slipping out into the alley with nothing but the clothes on her back and $3 silver stolen from a drunkard's trousers. Nora shook the water from her hands and dried them on her apron. The memory made her throat tight, a phantom sensation of choking that she could never quite wash away. She had come to Cottonwood Springs because it was small, because it was at the end of the rail line, and because she thought no one here would know her face. She was wrong. Rumors traveled faster than the telegraph in the West. Within a week of her taking the job at the boarding house, the whispers began. Respectable wives pulled their children closer when she passed on the boardwalk. The pastor at the little white church had preached a sermon on the Jezebel spirit, his eyes boring into Nora, where she sat in the back pew until she fled before the final hymn. She was marked. Nora turned back to the stove, stirring the large pot of stew that was simmering for the evening meal. The heat of the iron range flushed her face. She worked with a mechanical efficiency, chopping potatoes, slicing stale bread, keeping her mind blank. The back door opened with a sudden bang, letting in a gust of wind and the smell of approaching winter. Nora jumped, turning quickly, a paring knife still clutched in her hand. Thomas Alders stood in the doorway, blocking the fading light. He was a handsome man in the way a wolf is handsome. Sleek, well-groomed, with eyes that were too pale and too intent. He wore a suit of fine gray wool, a stark contrast to the rough denim and canvas worn by the other men in town. His father owned the bank, the dry goods store, and half the land east of the river. Thomas owned nothing but his name, yet he walked as if the very earth owed him tribute. "You are jumpy tonight." "Nora," Thomas said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Nora turned back to the potatoes, her knuckles white on the handle of the knife. "Mr. Alder, the kitchen is for staff only. Mrs. Higgins will not like you being back here. Mrs. Higgins knows who holds the mortgage on this shack," Thomas said, his voice smooth, like oil sliding over gravel. He moved closer, his boots clicking on the floorboards. "Besides, I am not here to see Mrs. Higgins." Nora moved around the central table, putting the heavy wood between them. "I have work to do." Thomas laughed softly. "You always have work to do, scrubbing floors, peeling potatoes. It is a waste. Nora, a woman with your talents. You know I can set you up in a house on the edge of town. You would not have to ruin your hands like this." Nora's stomach turned. She had heard this offer before, weeks ago, when he had first recognized her. He had been a patron in Denver, one of the men who liked to hurt things just to see if they would break. "I am not for sale." "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Not anymore." Thomas's face hardened. He moved with sudden speed, rounding the table before she could react. He caught her wrist, his grip like an iron manacle, twisting her arm until she dropped the knife with a clatter. "You were bought and paid for," he hissed, dragging her toward him. "I sent the money to the house in Denver. I paid for your transport here. You think you escaped? You think you just happened to land in my town?" Nora gasped, the air leaving her lungs. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He had brought her here. It had not been chance. It had been a trap from the beginning. "Let me go," she cried, struggling against his weight. Thomas shoved her backward. She slammed against the rough plaster wall, her head cracking against the shelf. Stars exploded behind her eyes. Before she could slide down, he was on her, his body pressing hers into the wood, his forearm jamming against her throat. "You owe me," he snarled, his breath smelling of brandy and peppermint. "You owe me for the train ticket. You owe me for the debt your father left. You belong to me, Nora, and I am tired of waiting." His free hand fumbled at the bodice of her dress, tearing at the fabric. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Nora's veins. It was the nightmare she had lived in the dark for 2 years, made flesh in the boarding house kitchen. "No!" she screamed, a raw, ragged sound. She clawed at his face, her fingernails digging into the soft flesh of his cheek. She felt skin tear. Thomas yelled in pain and surprise. Jerking his head back, blood welled up in 3 bright red streaks across his left cheekbone. He touched his face, looking at the blood on his fingertips with disbelief that quickly turned to a murderous rage. "You filthy whore," he whispered, raising his hand to strike her. Outside, in the alley, a dog barked viciously, followed by the loud crash of a trash can overturning and a man shouting a drunken curse. The noise broke the moment. Thomas froze, his eyes darting to the door. He was a predator, but he was a predator who cared deeply about his camouflage. To be caught assaulting a servant in a kitchen would be messy. It would require explanations. He stepped back, smoothing his jacket, his chest heaving. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his bleeding cheek, his eyes never leaving Nora. She stood pressed against the wall, clutching her torn bodice, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "This is not over," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrified calm. "You think you can scratch me? You think you can say no? I will tell the sheriff." Nora gasped, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. Thomas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Sheriff Miller, who do you think pays his salary? Who do you think buys his whiskey? Go ahead and tell him. Tell him a whore from Denver attacked a respected businessman. See where that gets you." He stepped closer, pointing a finger in her face. "You have until tonight. I am coming back at dinner. You are going to pack your things and come with me, quietly. If you don't, I will have you thrown in jail for theft. I will say you stole a diamond ring from my mother. They will lock you up, Nora, and in that cell, you will be begging me to come get you." He turned and walked out the door, leaving Nora alone in the darkening kitchen. She slid down the wall until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The smell of the stew, rich and savory, made her want to retch. She was trapped. There was no money in her boot, only a few copper pennies. There was no train leaving tonight. The sheriff was Thomas's creature. She was going to be dragged back into the darkness, and this time, she knew she would not survive it. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. When Elias McCrae rode into Cottonwood Springs, he did not ride like the cowboys who came into town on Saturday nights, whooping and firing pistols into the air. He rode in silence, a dark silhouette against the dying light. He sat atop a massive bay stallion, a beast with shoulders like a plow horse and legs like iron. Behind him, linked by a lead rope, trailed 2 pack horses loaded high with sacks of flour, coffee, and coils of barbed wire. Eli McCrae was a man who looked as if he had been carved out of the landscape itself, hard, weathered, and unyielding. He wore a long duster coat that had once been tan, but was now the color of roadway dust. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but the light caught the jagged line of a scar that ran from his ear down across his jaw, vanishing into his collar. He had a limp. It was subtle, visible only when he shifted his weight in the stirrups, a stiffness in his left leg that spoke of a bone shattered and poorly set. As he passed the livery stable, the hostler, an old man named Jeb, paused in his sweeping and spat on the ground. "Evening. McCrae," Jeb muttered, not looking up. Eli nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. "Jeb." He did not stop to talk. He never did. Eli McCrae came to town 4 times a year for supplies, and he left as soon as the last buckle was fastened. 2 men standing outside the general store watched him pass. "That is him," one whispered. "The one from the Rock Creek feud. I heard he killed 3 men in one night," the other replied, watching Eli's broad back. "I heard he burned his own house down with his wife inside because she looked at another man," the first said, his voice thick with the pleasure of scandal. "He is a cold son of a bitch, that is for sure. Look at the way he sits that horse, like he is waiting for someone to take a shot at him." Eli heard the murmurs. He had hearing like a deer, honed by years of sleeping with one ear pressed to the ground. He did not care. The words of men in towns meant nothing to him. Towns were cages. People were complications. He pulled the stallion, Ranger, up to the hitching rail outside the boarding house. He needed a hot meal before the long ride back to the high country. And Mrs. Higgins made a pot roast that was worth the noise of civilization. Inside the kitchen, Nora was washing dishes, her hands moving robotically. She looked out the window as Eli dismounted. She saw the size of him, the width of his shoulders under the duster. She saw the way he tied the reins, a slip knot, easily released in a second. She saw him pause before stepping onto the boardwalk, scanning the street left and right. It was the movement of a hunted thing. She recognized it because she did it herself every time she stepped out a door. He looks tired, she thought, the thought surprising her. He looks like he has been walking for 100 years. She watched him limp up the steps, and for a second, she felt a strange kinship with this stranger. He was scarred, and he was alone. But then the fear washed back over her. He was a man, and tonight, all men were enemies. The dining room of the boarding house was crowded. 6 tables were pushed together in the center for the railway workers, who were loud and smelled of creosote. 2 smaller tables sat near the window, occupied by the town judge and his sour-faced wife. Eli sat alone at a small table in the far corner, his back to the wall. He ate methodically, cutting his meat into precise squares, his eyes flicking up every time the door opened. Nora moved through the room like a ghost, refilling water glasses and clearing plates. She had pinned the tear in her dress with a safety pin and rubbed flour over the bruises on her neck. But she could feel the eyes of the judge's wife on her, sharp and judgmental. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Thomas Alder strode in, flanked by the sheriff. A heavy man with a potbelly and a tin star that looked too shiny for his dusty vest. Thomas's cheek was bandaged, a stark white strip against his flushed skin. The room went quiet. The railway workers lowered their forks. "There she is!" Thomas shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Nora, who stood near the kitchen door holding a pitcher of water. "That is the thief!" "Sheriff, arrest her!" Nora froze. The pitcher trembled in her hand, water sloshing over the rim. "Now, Mr. Alder," the sheriff said, his voice bored but obedient. "Let us do this proper. Nora Hayes, Mr. Alder claims you stole a gold pocket watch and $50 from his person earlier this evening." "I did not," Nora cried, her voice thin and high. "I never took anything. He attacked me." "Liar!" Thomas roared. He marched across the room, kicking a chair out of his way. "You are a whore and a thief. I tried to help you, gave you work. And this is how you repay me." He reached her, grabbing her arm so hard the pitcher fell from her hand, shattering on the floorboards. Water soaked the hem of her skirt. "You are coming with me," Thomas spat, dragging her toward the door. "We will see how much you steal when you are rotting in a cell." "Let me go, please," Nora begged, looking around the room. The railway workers looked down at their plates. The judge cleared his throat and looked out the window. His wife sniffed, muttering. I knew she was trouble. No one moved. No one spoke. The power of Thomas Alder's money was a heavy blanket that smothered all courage in the room. Thomas grinned, a rictus of triumph. He pulled Nora harder, enjoying her terror, enjoying the way she stumbled. "Let her go." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the room like a blade through canvas. It was a deep voice, rough with disuse, resonating from the corner. Thomas stopped. He turned, his eyes narrowing. Eli McCrae had not stood up. He was still sitting, his knife and fork resting on his plate. He held a coffee cup in one large hand, halfway to his mouth. He looked at Thomas with eyes that were the color of flint, gray, hard, and utterly unimpressed. Thomas sneered. "Stay out of this, rancher. This is town business." "I said, let her go," Eli repeated. He took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down with a deliberate click. "You have no authority here." "McCrae," Thomas said, though his voice wavered slightly. "Everyone knows you are crazy. Everyone knows what happened to your family. Maybe you want the whore for yourself. Is that it? You lonely out there in the rocks?" The room seemed to drop 10 degrees in temperature. The reference to Eli's family was a line no one crossed. The railway workers shifted uneasily. Eli slowly pushed his chair back. The sound of wood scraping on wood was deafening in the silence. He stood up, unfolding his height until he loomed over the room. He limped forward, his spurs chiming softly with each step. He stopped 3 feet from Thomas, up close. The difference between them was comical. Thomas was a soft man in a fine suit. Eli was a wall of muscle and scar tissue. Thomas released Nora's arm instinctively. Stepping back, "She owes me," Thomas stammered, trying to regain his bluster. "She owes a debt." "How much?" Eli asked. "What? How much is the debt?" Thomas blinked. It is irrelevant. It is a matter of principle." "She—" "Name the price," Eli interrupted. Thomas looked around, sensing he was losing the audience. $50. She owes me $50 for transport and damages. Eli reached into his duster coat. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun, but Eli only pulled out a leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring and poured a stream of gold coins onto the nearest table. They clattered loudly. He counted them out with a calloused thumb. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. He added 2 more coins, and 10 for the nuisance. Eli said. He looked at Thomas. "The debt is settled. She owes you nothing." Thomas stared at the gold. His face turned a mottled red. "You cannot just buy her. McCrae, she is not cattle." "You were the one selling," Eli said coldly. "I am just paying the bill." He turned his back on Thomas, a gesture of supreme disrespect, and looked at Nora. She was standing amidst the broken pottery and water, shivering, her face pale as milk. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to claim his prize. Eli did not touch her. He did not smile. He looked at her with a strange, grave intensity. "I need a cook," he said, "and a housekeeper. The place is a wreck. I pay $20 a month in room and board." Nora stared at him. She could not find her voice. The judge's wife let out a loud gasp. Taking a fallen woman to that God-forsaken ranch? We all know what kind of work she will be doing. Someone in the back snickered. "Keeps the bed warm in winter." Eli's jaw tightened, the scar turning white. But he did not look away from Nora. He waited. "You want out of here?" he asked softly. The question hung in the air. Nora looked at Thomas, who was glaring at the gold with greedy, hateful eyes. She looked at the sheriff, who was useless. She looked at the town that had scorned her. Then she looked at Eli. His face was hard. Yes, but his eyes were not cruel. There was a stillness in them, a vast, empty silence that terrified her, but also beckoned to her. It was a choice between the wolf she knew and the bear she didn't. Nora took a breath that rattled in her chest. She nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Speak up," Eli said. "Yes," Nora said, louder. "I want out." Eli nodded. "Get your things. We ride at first light." He turned back to Thomas. "If you come near her again, Alder, or if you try to stop her leaving, I will not pay with gold next time." He let the threat hang there, heavy and unmistakable. Then he sat back down at his table and picked up his fork. Nora's room was a closet under the eaves, freezing cold and dark. The wind rattled the shutters like a dying man trying to get in. She packed her bag by the light of a single tallow candle. She had one extra dress, a gray wool skirt, a shawl, and her mother's Bible. It did not take long. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot, her hands trembling in her lap. She had just agreed to ride into the wilderness with a man the whole town feared, a man with a dead wife and a reputation for violence. She touched the bruise forming on her wrist where Thomas had grabbed her. She was trading one prison for another. She was sure of it. Men were all the same in the end. They all wanted something. They all took, but as she listened to the wind howling outside, she remembered the way Eli had stood between her and Thomas. He hadn't looked at her body. He hadn't looked at her with that hungry, sliding gaze she knew so well. He had looked at her like she was a person in a bad spot. "You want out of here?" Nora blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. "God help me," she whispered to the empty room. "I do." Dawn broke over Cottonwood Springs like a bruise healing on the horizon, a streak of sullen purple bleeding into gray. The air was sharp enough to cut, smelling of frost and coal smoke. In the livery yard, the ground was hard as iron, the frozen mud ruts catching the heels of boots and hooves alike. Nora Hayes stood by the gate, her breath pluming in white clouds before her face. She wore her heaviest dress, the gray wool with the mended hem, and a shawl wrapped 3 times around her shoulders. But the cold still found its way to her bones. She clutched her small carpetbag with both hands, her knuckles white. Elias McCrae moved around the horses with a quiet economy of motion. He did not speak to her. He was checking the cinch on a small, shaggy mare that looked as if she had seen better winters. He tightened the strap, the leather creaking in the silence, and the mare grunted. "Stomping a hoof, this is Bess," Eli said, his voice rough with morning phlegm. "She is not fast, but she is sure-footed. Do not fight her mouth. She knows the way better than you do." Nora nodded, though he was not looking at her. "I have ridden before. Mr. McCrae. My father kept horses when I was a girl." Eli paused, glancing at her over the saddle. "That was a long time ago. Miss Hayes, the land out here is different. It does not forgive mistakes." He turned back to his own horse, the massive bay stallion named Ranger. The animal was a beast of war, nearly 17 hands high, with a chest like a whiskey barrel and eyes that watched everything with a nervous intelligence. Eli swung up into the saddle, the leather groaning under his weight, and looked down at her. "Mount up. We are burning daylight." Nora struggled onto the mare, her skirts tangling briefly before she settled. She felt exposed, perched up high, around the livery yard. The town was beginning to stir. The baker was scraping ash from his oven, and 2 men were loading crates onto a wagon near the general store. They stopped their work to watch, their eyes sliding over Nora with that familiar mix of judgment and speculation. She heard a whisper carry on the thin air. "Look at that, taking her out to the rocks. Reckon she is worth the trip." Nora kept her eyes forward, fixing her gaze on the back of Eli's duster coat. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her shame. They rode out of the yard, the horses' hooves clopping loudly on the frozen earth. As they reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the endless, open prairie, a figure stepped out from the shadow of the jailhouse. It was Sheriff Miller. He leaned against a hitching post, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He wore a sheepskin coat that was too tight across his gut, and his hat was pushed back to reveal a hairline that was retreating from a greasy forehead. "Morning, McCrae," Miller called out. Eli pulled Ranger to a halt. The stallion danced sideways, sensing his rider's tension. "Sheriff, going for a little trip?" Miller asked, his eyes drifting to Nora. He smiled, a lazy, wet expression that made Nora's skin crawl. "You know, there are laws about transporting women of questionable character across the territory. We like to keep things decent in this county." Nora felt her face burn. She gripped the reins, wishing the ground would open up and swallow her. Eli did not smile. He rested one hand on the pommel of his saddle, the other hanging loose near his hip. "She is a hired hand. Miller, cook and housekeeper. Unless you have a law against a man hiring help, I suggest you step aside." Miller chuckled, spitting a piece of wood onto the ground. "Hired hand, is that what we are calling it now? Well, you be careful out there. Eli, a woman like that, she brings trouble, usually the kind that follows a man home." "She is not cargo," Eli said, his voice dropping an octave. "Becoming flat and deadly, she is free to travel. And I am done talking." He clicked his tongue, and Ranger surged forward. Nora kicked the mare, following close behind, refusing to look at the sheriff as they passed. She felt his eyes on her back, sticky and unclean, until the town was just a smudge of smoke behind them. Once the buildings were gone, the world opened up in a way that was terrifying. Nora had traveled by train to get to Cottonwood Springs, watching the west blur past through a dirty window. But riding through it was different. There was no glass to separate her from the sheer, crushing size of it. The plains rolled out in every direction, a sea of brown grass that hissed in the wind. In the distance, jagged blue mountains tore at the sky, looking impossibly far away. The sky itself was too big, a vast, pale dome that made Nora feel like an ant crawling across a dinner plate. There was nowhere to hide. If God was watching, he could see everything. Eli rode ahead, a solitary figure cutting a path through the sagebrush. He did not look back often. Occasionally, he would raise a gloved hand to point at something, a hawk circling on a thermal, a cluster of antelope watching them from a ridge, or a patch of riddled ground. "Prairie dog town," he called back over his shoulder. "Keep her head up. A horse steps in a hole. You both go down." "Thank you," Nora said, her voice snatched away by the wind. By midday, the silence had settled into her. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, indifferent silence. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the jingle of bit chains, and the relentless wind. Eli slowed Ranger and dropped back until he was riding beside her. He looked her over, checking her seat, checking the mare. "You riding all right?" he asked. Nora nodded, though her inner thighs were already aching and her lower back throbbed. "I am fine. Mr. McCrae," Eli grunted. "It is just Eli. No need for Mr. out here. The cows do not care about titles." Nora managed a weak smile. "Eli, then—" He took a pull from his canteen and offered it to her. She took it, the metal cold against her lips, the water tasting faintly of tin. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly, handing the canteen back. Eli wiped the mouth of the vessel with his thumb. "Do what? Stand up to Thomas. Pay the money. You do not even know me." Eli corked the canteen and hooked it back onto his saddle. He looked out at the horizon, squinting against the glare. "I know men like Thomas Alder," he said quietly. "I know what they do when they think no one is looking. And I needed a cook. My biscuits are hard enough to break a window." It was a deflection, and they both knew it. But Nora did not press him. She was learning that Eli McCrae was a man who rationed his words like water in a drought. By late afternoon, the sky began to change. The pale blue turned a sickly yellow in the west, and dark, bruised clouds began to pile up over the mountains, tumbling over one another in a race to cover the sun. The wind picked up, shifting from a steady breeze to gusts that slapped at their faces. Eli stopped, standing in his stirrups to study the sky. "Storm coming," he said, his face grim, "moving fast. We need to cross the Washburn Gorge before it hits. If the rain starts up in the high country, that river will flash." He spurred Ranger into a trot. "Keep up, Nora. Do not lag behind." They pushed the horses, the easy pace of the morning forgotten. The landscape grew rougher, the rolling grass giving way to rocky outcrops and twisted scrub oak. The ground sloped downward, leading them toward a deep gash in the earth where the river cut through the stone. When they reached the edge of the gorge, Nora's heart sank. The river was already running high, a dark, churning ribbon of water that foamed white around the boulders. The crossing was narrow, a shallow ford that looked treacherous even in good weather. The wind was howling now, whipping Nora's hair across her face, stinging her eyes. "We have to go now," Eli shouted over the wind. "Follow my line. Do not let her stop." He drove Ranger into the water. The stallion hesitated, then plunged in, the water rising to his knees. Nora kicked Bess. The mare took 2 steps, smelled the ozone in the air and the rising damp of the river, and balked. She threw her head up, backing away, her hooves scrabbling on the slick river stones. "Come on," Nora cried, kicking harder. "Bess, move!" The mare panicked. She reared slightly, twisting her body. Nora lost her stirrup, sliding dangerously to the side. The river roared below them, hungry and waiting. Eli saw it happen. He spun Ranger around in the water, the massive horse fighting the current. "Hold on!" Eli roared. He forced the stallion back up the bank, water spraying from Ranger's chest. He brought the horse alongside the dancing mare, reaching out with a long arm to grab Bess's bridle, wrenching her head down. "She is not going to cross," Eli shouted. "She smells the flood coming." Nora was clinging to the pommel, terrified. "What do we do?" Eli did not answer with words. He dropped the mare's reins and leaned over, wrapping his left arm around Nora's waist. "Let go of the saddle," he ordered. "What? Let go! I have got you!" Before she could protest, he hauled her out of her saddle. Nora gasped as she was lifted into the air, her legs dangling over the rushing water. For a second, she was suspended between the 2 horses, weightless and vulnerable. Then Eli pulled her across his lap, settling her sideways in front of him on the stallion's withers. "Leave the mare. She will follow if she is empty, or she will run back home. We cannot wait." He gathered the reins, his arms caging her in. Nora felt the heat of him instantly, a solid wall of warmth against her back. She was perched precariously on the stallion's neck, her legs hanging down on the left side, her hands grasping for purchase on the saddle horn. Ranger snorted, tossing his head, unhappy with the double weight and the smell of the storm. The horse felt immense beneath her, a living engine of muscle and bone. Eli tightened his grip, his chest pressing against her shoulder blades. He leaned close to her ear, his voice calm despite the chaos of the wind and water. "Too big. Just sit tight." He meant the horse. He meant the river. But as the words vibrated against her spine, Nora felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with fear. The phrase settled deep in her stomach. She was acutely aware of his thighs bracketing hers, the iron strength of the arm locked around her waist. Ranger surged forward. This time, the entry was violent. The water hit them like a physical blow. Cold and heavy, the stallion stumbled, then found his footing, his powerful legs churning against the current. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in the rough wool of Eli's duster. She could feel the river clawing at the horse, trying to drag them downstream. She could hear the boulders grinding together under the water. "Hold on, Nora," Eli murmured, his chin brushing the top of her head. "I have got you. We are all right." She realized then, with a jolt of clarity, that she was trusting him completely. She had known him for less than 24 hours. He was a stranger with a scar and a gun. But as the water rushed around her boots and the horse surged beneath her, she knew he would not let her fall. The crossing took a lifetime, though it was likely only 3 minutes. When Ranger lunged up the far bank, water streaming from his flanks, Nora let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. The horse shook himself, a massive shudder that rattled Nora's teeth. Eli guided them up the slope to solid ground before reining in. He looked down at her, his face wet with spray. "You all right?" he asked. Nora looked at him, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her dress soaked to the knees. She started to laugh. It was a jagged, nervous sound, bordering on hysteria. "I think so," she gasped. I have never been on a horse this big." Eli's eyes crinkled at the corners. A faint ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "He is a lot of horse," he agreed. He swung his leg over the cantle and slid to the ground, landing with a heavy thud. He reached up, placing his hands on her waist to lift her down. For a second, as she slid down the length of him, they were chest to chest. Her feet touched the ground, but he did not immediately let go. His hands were large and warm through the damp wool of her dress. She looked up at him, her breath hitching. His pupils were blown wide, dark pools in the gray light. The electricity between them was sharp, sudden, and terrifying. Then he stepped back, his face closing down like a shutter. "We need to keep moving," he said roughly. "The rain is starting." He turned away to check the pack horses, which had managed to scramble across behind them, followed by a reluctant, riderless Bess. They pushed on. The storm broke over them with a fury that felt personal. The rain was cold, turning to sleet as the temperature plummeted. The wind shrieked through the scrub oak, bending the branches until they snapped. Nora rode Bess again, her hands numb in her gloves, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The landscape had turned hostile. The vastness that had seemed indifferent earlier now felt like a trap. The mountains were gone, swallowed by the clouds. There was only the mud, the wind, and the back of Eli's coat. They rode until the light failed completely. Eli led them into a small box canyon where a slab of sandstone jutted out from the cliff face, forming a shallow cave. It was not much, but it was out of the wind. "We camp here," he shouted over the gale. He worked with a desperate speed. He hobbled the horses, rubbing them down briefly with a handful of dry grass from under the overhang. He gathered deadwood that had been sheltered from the rain, building a small, smoky fire against the back wall of the stone shelter. Nora stood by the fire, shivering violently. Her clothes were sodden, heavy and clinging to her skin. She could not stop shaking. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Eli turned to her. He looked at her blue lips, her pale skin. His expression was hard, professional. "You need to get those wet things off," he said. "You will catch your death if you stay in them." Nora wrapped her arms around herself. I cannot." Eli cursed softly under his breath. He unrolled his bedroll, a thick canvas tarp lined with heavy wool blankets. He laid it out near the fire. "I am not asking for a show. Nora, I am trying to keep you from freezing." He took his saddle and propped it up on its side, draping his slicker over it to create a makeshift screen. "Go behind there," he said, turning his back to her. "Hang your dress and your underthings on the rock near the fire. Wrap yourself in the blankets. I will not look." Nora hesitated, but the cold was a knife in her ribs. She stepped behind the saddle, Her fingers were clumsy with the buttons, frozen and stiff. She peeled the wet wool from her body, the air hitting her damp skin like a lash. She stripped down to nothing. In the flickering firelight, she looked down at herself. The bruises from Thomas's hands were dark purple blooms on her pale skin. She saw the old scars, a cigarette burn on her shoulder from a drunk in Denver, a thin white line on her thigh where her father had once struck her with a belt buckle. She felt ugly, used. She hurried into the bedroll, pulling the rough wool up to her chin. The blankets smelled of horse, tobacco, and Eli. It was a masculine, earthy scent that was strangely comforting. "I am decent," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible over the storm. Eli turned. He did not look at the bundle of blankets. He moved to the fire, adding more wood. He sat down, staring into the flames. He was still wearing his damp coat, shivering slightly himself. The temperature continued to drop. The sleet turned to snow, hissing as it hit the fire. Nora lay on the hard ground, the cold from the stones seeping through the canvas. She curled into a tight ball, but she could not get warm. Her shivering became a convulsion, her teeth rattling uncontrollably. Eli watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw the way the blankets shook. He saw the pallor of her face in the firelight. He sat there for a long time, wrestling with himself. He was a man who had sworn off closeness. He had buried his heart in the ashes of his ranch house 5 years ago. Touching a woman, especially this woman, with her terrified eyes and her bruised spirit, felt like walking into a minefield, but he was practical above all else. "Nora," he said. She made a small, wretched sound in her throat. "You are hypothermic," he said flatly. "The fire is not enough." He stood up and began to unbutton his coat. "I am coming in," he said, "for warmth only. Do not get the wrong idea." Nora's eyes went wide. She started to protest, to scramble away, but her body betrayed her. She was so cold it hurt to breathe. Eli stripped off his coat, his boots, and his outer shirt, leaving him in his long johns. He lifted the edge of the blankets and slid in beside her. He lay with his back to her, leaving a clear 6 inches of space between them. He was rigid, his muscles coiled tight. "Go to sleep," he said. They lay there in the silence of the storm. The wind howled like a banshee. The cold crept in from the edges of the tarp, insidious and relentless. Nora shivered. The tremors were violent, racking her frame. Eli let out a long, resigned sigh. "Come here," he muttered. He rolled over and reached for her. Nora stiffened, panic flaring, but he did not grab. He simply opened his arm, creating a space. "It is just body heat. Nora, I promise." She hesitated for a heartbeat, then scooted backward. His arm settled around her, heavy and solid. He pulled her against him, fitting her back to his chest. The heat of him was shocking. He was a furnace. Nora gasped softly as the warmth began to seep into her frozen skin. She tucked her head under his chin, her body instinctively seeking the heat source. They lay still. Eli's heart was beating against her spine, a slow, steady rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. It was the most grounding sound she had ever heard. Gradually, her shivering subsided. The terror of the day began to bleed away, replaced by a strange, heavy exhaustion. In the darkness, with the fire dying down to embers, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of the other. "My father used to gamble," Nora whispered. She didn't know why she said it. The words just fell out. He thought he was lucky. He was not. Eli did not move. He did not shush her. He owed $3,000. She continued, her voice sounding small in the cave. "To bad men. When he could not pay, he gave them me. He signed a paper, like I was a horse or a wagon." She felt Eli's arm tighten slightly around her ribs. A subtle pressure. "I'm sorry," he rumbled. His voice vibrated through her chest. "He died 3 weeks later." She said, "I was there for 2 years. I ran when the madam died. I thought if I went far enough, it would not matter. But the mud follows you." "It does." Eli said. He was quiet for a long time. Nora thought he might have fallen asleep. I had a place, he said finally. Before the ranch I have now. Up on Rock Creek. Nora waited. She knew the stories, or pieces of them, but hearing it from him felt like a transgression. There was a drought, he said. Bad one. My neighbors. The cattle company. They wanted my water. I said no. They came at night. His breath hitched, a tiny fracture in his composure. They barred the doors from the outside, set the roof on fire. I was in the barn, calving a heifer. By the time I got there, the roof had come down. Nora closed her eyes, tears leaking out to wet the wool of the blanket. She could feel the agony radiating off him, a heat far more intense than his body warmth. "Sarah," he whispered. And William. He was 4 months old. He stopped. There were no words for that kind of hollow. "I tracked them," he said, his voice turning into grinding stone. "Took me 6 months. I found them all." He did not say what he did when he found them. He didn't have to. Nora knew. She could feel the violence in him, the coiled spring of a man who had walked through hell and come out carrying the fire with him. They lay there, two broken things pressed together against the dark. Nora Hayes, who had been sold, and Eli McCrae, who had failed to save what mattered. "I am sorry," Nora whispered. "Don't be," Eli said. "Sorrow does not fix fences." But as the night wore on, his hand, which had been resting in a fist against her stomach, slowly uncurled, his fingers spread out, resting flat against her, holding her not just for warmth, but as if he needed to feel that she was there, that she was alive. It was a fragile connection, spun from grief and exhaustion, but it was there. Nora fell asleep listening to his heart, and for the first time in years, she did not dream of the room with the red curtains. Morning came with a blinding brilliance. Nora woke to the smell of coffee. She was alone in the bedroll. She sat up, clutching the blankets to her chest, blinking against the light. The storm was gone. The world outside the overhang had been scrubbed clean. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue. Snow dusted the distant peaks, white and pristine, and the wet earth steamed in the rising sun, smelling of sage and rich mud. Eli was crouching by the fire, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He was fully dressed, his coat buttoned to his chin. He looked tired, lines etched deep around his eyes, but he looked steady. "Morning," he said, not looking at her. "Coffee is ready." Nora scrambled to dress behind the saddle, her fingers fumbling. When she emerged, she felt shy, the intimacy of the night before hanging between them like a ghost. She took the cup he offered. "Thank you. We have a long ride today," Eli said, standing up and kicking dirt over the fire. "We should make the ranch by sunset if the creek does not rise." He looked at her then, really looked at her. His gaze was searching, intense. "You slept?" he asked. "Yes," Nora said. "I did. Good." He turned to the horses. Nora watched him, feeling a strange fluttering in her chest. It was not quite hope. Hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to, but it was not fear either. It was something new, like a seed planted in hard ground, waiting to see if it could survive the frost. She drank the bitter coffee, watching the steam rise into the cold air, and realized she was ready to get back on the horse. She was ready to see what lay at the end of the trail. Too big, just sit tight. She took a deep breath of the thin, clean air. She could do that. She could sit tight. The McCrae Ranch lay in the throat of a narrow valley, a solitary collection of structures huddled against the immense backdrop of the high plains. To Nora Hayes, seeing it for the first time in the bleaching light of afternoon, it looked less like a home and more like a fortification against the wind. The main house was a low-slung cabin of weathered logs, their chinking cracked by years of freeze and thaw. A barn, leaning slightly to the east, stood guard over a corral made of gray rails, and a line of cottonwood trees, twisted into tortured shapes by the prevailing gale, marked the course of a seasonal creek. It was stark, beautiful, and utterly unforgiving. When they rode into the yard, the silence was absolute, save for the dry rattle of leaves and the stamp of the horses. There was no welcoming committee, no dog barking on the porch, just the land, waiting to see if they were strong enough to stay. Eli dismounted first, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. He did not offer a tour. He simply pointed to the cabin. "Doors unlocked," he said, beginning to uncinch the packs from the horses. "It has been a while since anyone but me was inside." Nora climbed down from the mare, her legs trembling from the miles they had covered. She took her small bag and walked up the steps of the porch. The wood groaned under her weight. The boards warped and gray. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air within was stale, thick with the smell of wood smoke that had died long ago, dust, and the musty scent of a bachelor's neglect. Shafts of light cut through the gloom, illuminating dancing motes of dust. The main room was sparse, a heavy table with one chair, a cold stone hearth, and shelves lined with tins and a few leather-bound books. In the corner, a pile of unwashed dishes sat on a dry sink, crusted with the remnants of meals past. It was a grim place, a place where a man came only to sleep and eat, not to live. Nora set her bag down. She looked at the grime on the windows, the soot staining the mantel, the broken hinge on a cupboard door that hung crookedly. Panic fluttered in her chest. A bird trapped in a chimney. She was miles from civilization, living with a stranger who barely spoke, in a house that felt like a tomb. But then she looked at her hands. They were shaking. She made fists, tightening them until the knuckles turned white. She was not a victim anymore. She was a hired hand. She had a job, and if she was going to survive here, she would make herself indispensable. She found a bucket and a rag. She walked out to the pump in the yard, filled the pail with freezing water, and marched back inside. She tied her skirt up, rolled her sleeves, and got to knees. She started scrubbing. For the next week, Nora waged war on the house. She scoured the floorboards until the wood shone pale and clean. She boiled the dishes in lye soap until the grease of months was gone. She beat the dust from the braided rugs, washed the windows until the mountains were visible through the glass, and organized the pantry tins by size and content. She worked until her back screamed and her hands were raw and blistered, but she did not stop. Work was a shield. As long as she was working, she was not thinking. As long as she was useful, she was safe. Eli watched this transformation with a wary unease. He was a man who had constructed his life around absence. He knew where every shadow fell in the room at sunset. He knew the silence of the house like he knew the back of his hand. Now, that silence was broken. He would come in at dusk, smelling of horse sweat and cold air, and the house would be warm. A fire would be crackling in the hearth. The smell of rising dough or stewing beef would hit him like a physical wall, stopping him in the doorway. One evening, he walked in to find a knitted shawl draped over the back of the spare chair. It was a simple thing, gray wool, frayed at the edges. But in the stark masculinity of the room, it looked explosive. It was proof of life, proof of her. He hung his hat on the peg, moving carefully, as if the room had suddenly become smaller. "Something smells good," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "Stew," Nora said without turning from the stove. "And biscuits. Though the flour is a bit weevil-eaten, I sifted out what I could." Eli sat at the table. He watched her move. She had a rhythm to her work now, a quick, efficient grace that reminded him of a bird hopping between branches. He caught himself listening for the sound of her humming, a low, tuneless melody she drifted into when she was kneading dough. It was a sound that scraped against the callus he had grown over his heart. "I fixed the hinge on the cupboard," he said, gesturing with a fork. "I noticed." Nora said, "Thank you. It closes right now." "Yes, it does." The conversation died there, suffocated by the weight of things unsaid. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of cutlery on tin plates. But it was a companionable silence, less sharp than the one Eli was used to. The ranch work did not stop at the door of the cabin. As the weeks turned, the reality of the cattle business set in. It was a life of brutal, repetitive labor. Drought had left the grass brittle, and the water holes were drying up. The fences, miles of barbed wire strung on cedar posts, were constantly being breached by desperate stock or roaming elk. Nora did not stay in the kitchen. She asked to ride. "I cannot pay you extra for range work," Eli said one morning as he saddled Ranger. "I do not want extra," Nora replied, tightening the cinch on Bess. "I want to learn. I cannot sit in that house all day waiting for the dust to settle." Eli grunted, but he did not argue. She rode with him into the high draws, hunting for strays. She learned to spot the tawny hide of a steer against the brown earth. She learned to mend fence, wearing heavy leather gloves to twist the rusted wire, snagging her skirts on the barbs until she finally sewed herself a split riding skirt from an old pair of Eli's canvas trousers. The work was grueling. At dawn, the water troughs were frozen solid. Nora took an axe and shattered the ice, the shards flying like glass. Freezing water soaking her apron. She hauled hay until her shoulders burned. She learned to hold a calf while Eli doctored it, smelling the blood and the iodine, feeling the animal's terror vibrating against her ribs. One afternoon, they found a calf in a rocky gully, separated from its mother. Its leg was swollen, infected from a coyote bite. It was wild with pain, thrashing as they approached. Eli roped it quickly, dismounting to flank it. He threw the calf to the ground, tying its legs with a piggin string. "Hold its head," he ordered, pulling a knife from his belt. "Keep its eye covered. It will calm down if it cannot see." Nora knelt in the dirt, pressing the calf's head down with her knees, covering its large, dark eye with her hand. The animal bawled, a high, desperate sound. Eli worked fast, lancing the abscess. The smell of corruption was instant and foul. He cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, his face set in a grim mask of concentration. But when the work was done and he untied the legs, the calf did not run. It lay there, exhausted and trembling. Eli did not stand up immediately. He holstered his knife and reached out, resting his large, scarred hand on the calf's neck. He rubbed the spot behind its ears, his thumb moving in slow, rhythmic circles. "Easy now, little one," he murmured. His voice was dropped low, soft as velvet, a tone Nora had never heard him use with a human. "You are all right. The bad part is done. Go find your mama." He helped the calf stand, steadying it until it found its footing. Nora watched him, still kneeling in the dirt. She saw the gentleness in his hands, hands that she knew could fire a gun or break a man's jaw. She saw the way he looked at the animal, with a profound, quiet respect for its suffering. In that moment, the terrifying stranger who had ridden into town vanished. In his place was a man who understood pain because he carried so much of it himself. Eli looked up and caught her staring. He straightened quickly, wiping his hands on his chaps, the mask slipping back into place. "We should head back," he said gruffly. "Sky is turning." Nora nodded, scrambling to her feet. But she carried the image of his hand on the calf's neck with her all the way back to the house. The days were filled with work, but the nights were filled with ghosts. Nora's nightmares returned with a vengeance. She would wake in the small, cramped spare room, gasping for air, her hands clawing at her throat. In the dark, the wind rattling the eaves sounded like footsteps in the hallway. The shadow of a branch against the window looked like a hand reaching for the latch. One night, the dream was so vivid she screamed. It was a short, strangled sound, cut off as she woke herself up, but it was loud enough. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, sweat cooling on her skin. A moment later, there was a soft knock on her door. "Nora?" Eli's voice was low, laced with sleep but alert. "You all right in there?" Nora wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to steady her breathing. Yes, I'm sorry. It was just a dream." There was a pause. She heard the floorboards creak, then the latch lifted, and the door opened a crack. Eli stood there, holding a kerosene lamp turned low. He was wearing his long johns and trousers, his suspenders hanging loose. The golden light cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the scar on his jaw. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold, respecting the boundary. "You were screaming," he said. "I am fine," Nora lied, wiping her eyes. "Go back to sleep." Eli looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was huddled against the headboard. He hesitated, looking down at the lamp, then made a decision. He walked into the room and set the lamp on the small bedside table. He sat down on the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped under his weight. He did not touch her. He just sat there, a solid, immovable presence against the dark. Was it him? Eli asked quietly. Alder? Him, Nora whispered. And others. There are always others. Eli nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, resting on his knees. I see fire sometimes, he said. When I close my eyes, I smell smoke. It gets into your nose and never comes out. Nora looked at his profile. He was sharing his own ghosts to chase away hers. Does it ever stop? She asked. The fear? I do not know, Eli admitted. I do not think it stops. I think you just get used to carrying it, like a heavy pack. Eventually, your shoulders get strong enough that you do not notice the weight so much. They sat in silence for a long time. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. You are safe here. Nora, Eli said finally. I check the doors every night. The rifle is by my bed. No one gets in. Nora looked at his broad back, the strength in his shoulders. For the first time in 2 years, she believed that might be true. Thank you, she whispered. Eli stood up, taking the lamp. Try to sleep. Morning comes early. After that night, the barrier between them grew thinner. In the evenings, after the dishes were done and the fire was banked, they began to talk. They talked about books. Nora had read the classics in the brothel, stealing moments with stolen volumes, while Eli read practical treatises on husbandry and history. They talked about the towns they had fled. Nora spoke of the noise of Denver, the crushing indifference of the crowds. Eli spoke of the silence of the high country, the way the stars looked different when you were alone. One night, while mending a bridle by the fire, Nora stopped and looked into the flames. I do not think I can be fixed, she said softly. Eli looked up from his book. What? People in town, the way they look at me, I am stained. Eli, it does not wash off. No matter how hard I scrub the floors, I do not think a man could ever look at me and see anything but what I was. Eli closed his book. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You are not a stain. Nora, you are a survivor. There is a difference. Is there? Nora asked bitterly. Not to them. To hell with them, Eli said, a flash of anger in his eyes. They see what they want to see. I see you. The words hung in the air, weighted and dangerous. Nora's breath hitched. And what do you see? She challenged him, her voice trembling. Eli looked at her. His gaze traveled over her face, taking in the firelight on her skin, the strength in her jaw, the sadness in her mouth. I see a woman who works harder than any hand I ever hired, he said. I see a woman who is brave enough to ride a stallion across a flood. I see. He stopped, pulling back from the edge of something he wasn't ready to say. I see someone who deserves better than she got. He finished quietly. I bring death. Eli, she said, her voice dropping. Trouble follows me. You and me both, Eli muttered, standing up to check the fire. I'm convinced I'm a curse. Nora, everyone I love burns. That is why I stay out here, to keep the fire away from folks. We are a pair. Then, Nora said with a sad smile. The whore and the killer? Maybe, Eli said. Or maybe we are just two people trying to get through the winter. While peace was being fragilely built in the cabin, war was being brewed in town. Gossip in Cottonwood Springs was a sport, and Nora Hayes was the prize quarry. The story had mutated as it traveled from the saloon to the church pew. Eli McCrae hadn't just hired a housekeeper. He had abducted a fallen woman to serve his perversions. The judge's wife, Mrs. Albright, led the charge. She held court in the dry goods store, whispering to the other wives. It is an abomination, she hissed, clutching her shawl. Living in sin out there, that woman will tempt good men into darkness. She is a blight on the territory. Thomas Alder fanned these flames with the precision of an arsonist. He was furious. Nora's escape was a stain on his ego, a public defiance of his power. He could not let it stand. He sat in the sheriff's office, his boots up on the desk, smoking a cigar. People are talking. Sheriff, Thomas said, blowing a ring of smoke at the ceiling. They say McCrae is running a rustling operation. They say he is hiding stolen cattle in those box canyons of his. And that woman. She is a criminal. A thief. Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable. He knew Eli McCrae was not a rustler. He knew Eli was a hard man, but an honest one. But he also knew who signed the bank drafts that kept the sheriff's department afloat. I need proof. Mr. Alder, Miller said, I cannot just arrest a man on rumors. Then get proof, Thomas snapped. Ride out there, check his brands, shake the trees and see what falls out. If you find one calf that does not belong, one discrepancy in his taxes, crush him. A week later, a group of 5 men rode under the McCrae Ranch gate. They were a brand inspection committee, deputized by the sheriff, but they looked more like a lynch mob in training. Thomas Alder was among them, riding a tall black horse, dressed in a pristine suit that looked out of place against the dust. Eli met them in the yard. He had his rifle in the crook of his arm, not aimed, but ready. Nora stood on the porch, a broom in her hand, her heart pounding. State your business, Eli said, his voice like grinding gravel. Just checking marks. McCrae, the lead deputy said. Spitting tobacco. Routine. Received reports of strays in this sector. Check them. Then, Eli said, the herd is in the south pasture. You will find my mark on every flank. The men rode past the house, their eyes sliding over Nora. Well, look at that, one of them sneered. The little dove has learned to sweep. Reckon she sweeps the bedroom best. Another laughed. Nora stood rigid, her knuckles white on the broom handle. She felt the shame rising, hot and suffocating. But she did not look down. She glared at them. Thomas stopped his horse near the porch. He looked at Nora with a possessive, hungry sneer. You look tired. Nora, he said, living rough does not suit you. Get off my land. Alder, Eli warned, stepping forward. Thomas ignored him. He kept his eyes on Nora. Remember what I said, the offer stands. When you get tired of playing house with a murderer, you know where to find me. Eli cocked the hammer of his rifle. It was a loud, distinct click in the silence. Thomas smiled, tipped his hat, and rode after the deputies. The inspection took hours. They pushed the cattle hard, shouting and whipping their horses, looking for any excuse. They found nothing. Eli's herd was small, but his books were clean, frustrated. The men gathered near the barn to water their horses before leaving. Eli was at the corral, arguing with the deputy about a damaged fence. Thomas saw his chance. He slipped into the barn, where he had seen Nora go to fetch eggs. The barn was dim, smelling of hay and manure. Nora was kneeling by a nest in the straw, placing brown eggs into her apron pocket. She heard the footsteps and stood up, turning quickly. Thomas stood between her and the door. I told you I would come back, he said, stepping closer. Nora backed up until she hit a stall door. What do you want? Thomas, I want what I paid for, he said. His voice was low, reasonable, which made it more terrifying. Look at this place. Nora, it is a hovel. You are working like a slave. Come back to town. I will set you up. I will forgive the debt. I will even forgive the scratch on my face. He reached out, his hand brushing her arm. All you have to do is be nice. Nora's fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, blinding rage. She thought of Eli's hand on the calf. She thought of the cold nights and the hard work and the first taste of dignity she had felt in years. I would rather die, she spat. Thomas's face twisted. You stupid He lunged for her. Nora didn't think. She grabbed the kerosene lantern hanging on the post beside her. It was lit, the flame dancing behind the glass. She swung it with all her strength. The lantern smashed at Thomas's feet. Glass shattered, and oil splashed across his boots and the straw-covered floor. The flame caught instantly, a sudden whoosh of orange fire flaring up between them. Thomas jumped back, shouting, stomping frantically to put out the fire on his pant leg. You crazy witch! You could burn the whole place down! Get out! Nora screamed, grabbing a pitchfork from the wall. Get out, or I will put this through your chest! The fire was small, consuming the straw quickly, But Thomas was a coward at heart. He saw the pitchfork. He saw the fire. And he saw the look in her eyes. He turned and ran. Nora grabbed a horse blanket and smothered the flames, beating the fire until it was dead smoke. Then she dropped the blanket and sank to her knees, sobbing. That night, the dam broke. Eli found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her head in her hands. She was shaking. "Nora, what happened? The barn smells like smoke." Nora looked up. Her face was streaked with tears and soot. "He came in," she choked out. "Thomas, he cornered me. I threw the lantern. I almost burned your barn down." Eli's face went dark. He crossed the room in 2 strides. "Did he touch you?" "No, but he will not stop. He will never stop." Nora stood up, her chair scraping back. She paced the room, wild with distress. "I have to leave. Eli, I am poison. I am dragging you down with me. They are going to destroy you to get to me. You heard them today. They think I am your whore." Eli finished the sentence flatly. "Yes," Nora cried. "And they will hang you for it if they can. I cannot let that happen. I have to go." She moved toward the door, as if to walk out into the night right then. Eli grabbed her. He caught her by the shoulders, his grip hard. He spun her around to face him. "You are not going anywhere," he said fiercely. "Let me go." Nora struggled, beating her fists against his chest. "I am ruining your life. My life was a wreck before you got here," Eli shouted back, shaking her slightly. "You think I care what they say? You think I care about their polite society? I chose this. Nora, I chose to bring you here, and I do not regret it." Not for a second. Nora went still. She looked up at him, her chest heaving. "You do not regret it?" she whispered. "Even with the shame?" "There is no shame in this house," Eli said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Only outside of it." They were standing close, too close. The adrenaline of the argument, the fear, and the months of proximity suddenly coalesced into a single, sharp point of tension. Eli looked down at her. He saw the soot on her cheek, the fire in her eyes. He felt her body trembling against his. The desire he had been suppressing, the fierce, terrifying need, surged up like a floodwater. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to crush her against him and tell her that she was the only thing in the world that made sense. He leaned in. His face was inches from hers. Nora's lips parted, her breath hitching. She tilted her head back, waiting, wanting, for a heartbeat. They were on the precipice. Then Eli froze. He saw the bruise on her wrist where she had bumped the table. He remembered the stories she had told him about the men who took what they wanted. He remembered his own hands, capable of so much violence. He pulled back as if he had been burned. He dropped his hands from her shoulders and stepped away, turning his back to her. "I will not be like the others," he muttered, his voice ragged. "I will not take advantage of a frightened woman in my own kitchen." The rejection hit Nora like a slap. She didn't hear his noble intention. She heard disgust. She saw him turn away and thought he had seen the stain he claimed wasn't there. She thought he had looked at her and realized he couldn't bring himself to touch a woman who had been used by half the county. She went cold. The hope that had been blooming in her chest withered instantly. "I understand," she said, her voice wooden. "I am sorry." She turned and fled to her room, slamming the door. Eli stood in the kitchen, listening to her cry through the thin walls. He gripped the edge of the table until the wood groaned. He hated himself. He wanted to go to her, but he was terrified that if he touched her again, he wouldn't be able to stop. And he would not add his name to the list of men who had used Nora Hayes. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the night. He spent the night in the barn, sleeping in the hay, staring up at the dark beams, trying to master the fire in his blood. The truce with the world lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, a rancher to the north, a man named Henderson, was hit. 50 head of cattle were driven off in the night. The rustlers left a trail that seemed to vanish into the rocks near the McCrae property line. It was professional work, but Thomas Alder made sure the town heard a different story. "It is McCrae," Thomas whispered in the saloon. "He is a gunman. He is desperate. He needs money to keep that woman of his. The sheriff, pressured by the bank and the town council, finally caved. He swore out a warrant. Nora was in the garden, trying to hack weeds out of the frozen soil. When she saw the dust cloud, she stood up, shading her eyes. A group of riders was coming fast. Not 5 men this time, 12, and the sun glinted off metal on their chests and in their hands. Eli came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands. He saw them too. He walked over to Nora. "Go inside," he said calmly. "Eli, go inside. Nora, bar the door. Do not come out unless I tell you." He walked to his horse, pulled his Winchester from the scabbard, and stood in the center of the yard. The sheriff rode in, flanked by deputies and grim-faced townsmen. Thomas Alder was there, smiling a thin, victorious smile. "Elias McCrae," the sheriff shouted, pulling his gun. "Throw down the weapon. You are under arrest for cattle rustling and grand larceny." Eli stood his ground, the rifle held loose in one hand. "You are making a mistake. Miller." The sheriff cocked his pistol. The judge signed the paper. "Eli, do not make us kill you right here." Nora watched from the window, her hand pressed to the glass. She saw the men circle him. She saw the trap snapping shut, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that the storm had finally broken down the door. The pounding on the heavy oak door shattered the dawn silence like a gunshot. It was a violent, rhythmic hammering that shook dust from the ceiling beams and sent Nora Hayes bolting upright in her bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. Outside, the wind was still howling, stripping the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods, but the voices rising above the gale were human and angry. "Open up, McCrae!" a voice bellowed. "By the authority of the county sheriff!" Nora scrambled out of bed, grabbing her wrapper and pulling it tight around her shivering frame. She rushed into the main room just as Eli emerged from his bedroom. He was fully dressed, his boots already on, his face set in a grim mask of resignation. He held his Winchester rifle in one hand, the barrel pointed at the floor. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice rough with sleep and tension. He unbarred the door and threw it open. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Behind him, 6 men on horseback filled the yard, their coats dusted with frost, their hands resting near their holsters. Thomas Alder was there, sitting tall on his black horse, a smirk playing on his lips that looked like a scar in the gray light. "Morning, Sheriff," Eli said, blocking the doorway with his broad shoulders. "You are making a lot of noise for an innocent man to wake up to. We have a warrant." "McCrae," Miller said, waving a folded paper. "Judge signed it last night. We are here to search the premises for stolen livestock. Henderson lost 50 head 3 days ago." Nora stepped up behind Eli, peering around his arm. The sight of the men, their hard eyes and cold faces, made her stomach turn. They looked at her not as a woman, but as evidence. "You searched the herd last week," Eli said, not moving. "You found nothing. We had a tip," Miller said, stepping forward. "Get out of the way, Eli, unless you want to add resisting arrest to the charges." Eli hesitated, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. Then, slowly, he leaned the weapon against the doorframe and stepped aside. "Search all you want," he said. "You will not find what is not here." The men dismounted, swarming the property like locusts. They kicked open the barn doors, overturned feed barrels, and tore through the tack room. Nora stood by the hearth, shivering, listening to the sounds of invasion. Thomas Alder did not join the search. He remained on his horse near the porch, watching Nora through the open door. "Found them!" a voice shouted from the back of the property. Eli stiffened. The deputy, a narrow-faced man named Calloway, came running from the small holding pen behind the breaking corral, a pen Eli rarely used, overgrown with weeds and hidden by a stand of scrub oak. "5 calves!" Calloway shouted, breathless and triumphant, freshly branded with Henderson's mark. "Right over the old one. They were pushed back in the brush." "That is a lie," Eli said, his voice flat and deadly. "I have not used that pen in 2 years." Miller walked back to the porch, shaking his head with mock disappointment. It looks like we found what was not here. Eli, you planted them, Nora cried out, stepping onto the porch. She could not stop herself. The injustice burned in her throat like acid. You brought them here in the night. Anyone can see that. Miller turned his lazy, hooded eyes toward her. And who is going to believe you? Miss Hayes? A woman with your history? Against the word of sworn deputies? He turned back to Eli. Elias McCrae, you are under arrest for grand larceny and cattle rustling. 2 deputies grabbed Eli's arms. He did not fight them. He knew that if he fought, they would kill him right there on his own porch and call it self-defense. He let them pull his hands behind his back, let them cinch the rope tight enough to cut off circulation. Nora rushed forward, grabbing Miller's sleeve. You cannot do this! It is a frame-up! Thomas Alder is doing this because of me. Miller shook her off as if she were a troublesome dog. Back off, woman. You are lucky we are not taking you in as an accomplice. They dragged Eli to his horse. Ranger danced and snorted, smelling the aggression in the air. But a deputy held the stallion's bit while they forced Eli into the saddle. They tied his feet beneath the horse's belly, treating him like a captured outlaw from a dime novel. Thomas Alder rode closer, leaning down so only Eli and Nora could hear. I told you. McCrae, Thomas whispered. You should have stuck to your rocks and your cows. Now you lose everything. Eli ignored him. He turned his head, locking eyes with Nora. His face was pale beneath his tan, his eyes dark with a fear she had never seen there before. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. Nora, he rasped. I am coming with you, she said, tears freezing on her cheeks. No, Eli's voice cracked, a sound of desperate command. Stay here, keep the house. Do not come to town. It is not safe. But Eli, promise me, he shouted, straining against the ropes. Stay put. Before she could answer, Miller slapped Ranger's rump. The stallion lunged forward, and the procession of men rode out of the yard, taking the only safety Nora had ever known with them. She stood on the porch, watching the dust settle, the silence rushing back in to fill the void. It was a terrible, empty silence. She waited 1 hour. She paced the cabin floor, wringing her hands until the skin was raw. She looked at the cold hearth, the unwashed breakfast plates, the life they had started to build. Stay put. He wanted to protect her. He thought that by keeping her away, he could shield her from the mud that was about to be flung. But Eli did not understand one thing. Nora was already covered in mud. She had drowned in it for years. She went to the bedroom and pulled on her riding skirt. She took the heavy wool coat Eli had given her and buttoned it to her chin. She went to the loose floorboard under the bed where she kept her savings, $7 she had earned selling eggs, and put the coins in her pocket. She marched out to the barn, saddled Bess with shaking hands, and mounted up. I am not staying put, she whispered to the wind. Not this time. Cottonwood Springs was vibrating with a dark, ugly energy. When Nora rode into town, it was past noon, but the saloons were already full. Men stood in clusters on the boardwalks, passing bottles and speaking in low, excited tones. The news of the arrest had spread like wildfire, fed by the dry timber of boredom and prejudice. As Nora guided the mare down the main street, the conversation stopped, heads turned. The silence followed her like a wave. There she is, a woman muttered from the doorway of the mercantile. The cause of it all. Nora kept her chin high, though her insides were water. She felt the eyes on her, stripping her, judging her, condemning her. She saw the smirk on the face of the blacksmith, the cold disgust in the eyes of the church ladies. She rode straight to the jailhouse. A crowd had already gathered. 20 or 30 men, mostly ranch hands and drifters, stood around the steps. They were drinking whiskey and laughing. But the laughter had an edge to it. A rope hung from the pommel of a saddle on a nearby horse, coiled and waiting. String him up before he hurts anyone else, a man shouted. Rustling is a hanging crime, another answered. Nora pushed her mare through the crowd. Men shouted at her, some reaching out to grab her bridle, but she kicked the horse forward, forcing them to part. She dismounted at the hitching rail and marched up the steps. Sheriff Miller stood in the doorway, blocking her path. "I told you to stay out of this," he said, picking his teeth. "I want to see him," Nora said, her voice trembling but loud enough to be heard. "Prisoners are not allowed visitors. I have a right to see him. I work for him," the crowd jeered. "Work for him," someone shouted. "We know what kind of work." Miller smiled. "Go home, Nora. Before these boys get any ideas, I'm not leaving until I see him." She stared at the sheriff, pouring every ounce of her will into her gaze. She saw the hesitation in his eyes. He was a bully, but he was a bully who liked to pretend he was a lawman. Denying a woman a visit looked cowardly. "5 minutes," Miller grunted, stepping aside. "Then you get out of my town." The jail smelled of stale urine, wet stone, and old fear. It was a single room with 2 iron-barred cells at the back. Eli was in the one on the left. He was sitting on the narrow cot, his head in his hands. When he heard the door open, he looked up. His face was bruised, a fresh cut bleeding sluggishly over his eye where someone had struck him. "Nora," he groaned, standing up and coming to the bars. "I told you not to come. I could not stay there." "Eli." The silence was too loud. She reached through the bars. He hesitated, then took her hands. His grip was desperate, his fingers cold. "They are going to kill you," she whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "I heard them outside. They have a rope." "I know," Eli said. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a man standing on a gallows trap door. "Thomas has them riled up. He paid for the whiskey. We have to do something. I will go to the judge. I will tell him everything." "It will not matter," Eli said, shaking his head. "Miller has the brands. He has the witnesses. And you. Nora, if you speak up, they will tear you apart. They will drag every dark thing from your past out into the light and use it to paint me blacker." "Let them!" Nora cried fiercely. "I do not care. I care." Eli gripped her hands tighter, pulling her close to the iron. "I will not let them destroy you to get to me. You have a chance. Nora, you can leave. Take Bess. Go west. Start over where no one knows the name McCrae." "And leave you to hang?" Nora asked, her voice breaking. "You think I can live with that? You think I can ride away and just forget?" She looked into his gray eyes, seeing the torture in them. He was willing to die to keep her clean. He was willing to let them win, as long as she survived. And in that moment, Nora realized something. She loved him. It was a terrifying, inconvenient, catastrophic love. But it was there, rooted deep in the bedrock of her soul. "I would rather be ruined," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I would rather be branded a whore in every newspaper in the territory than walk away and let them take you." Eli stared at her. He opened his mouth to speak, to argue. But the door banged open. "Time is up," Miller barked from the doorway. Eli squeezed her hands one last time. "Go, Nora, please." Nora pulled her hands away. She did not say goodbye. She turned and walked out, her face set in stone. She did not go home. She went to the small boarding house where she had first stayed. She rented a room for the night with her egg money. She sat on the bed, listening to the noise of the town growing louder as the sun went down. She had a plan. It was a suicide mission for her reputation, but it was the only card she had left to play. Tomorrow, when the circuit judge arrived, she would stand in the street. She would scream the truth until someone listened. She would tell them about Thomas Alder. She would tell them about the assault. She would tell them about the extortion. She would burn her own name to ash if it meant creating enough smoke to blind them. But Thomas Alder knew that, too. Night fell heavy and cold. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. Around midnight, Nora was startled awake by a roar from the street. It sounded like the ocean crashing against cliffs, a chaotic, violent surge of noise. She ran to the window. Below, the street was filled with torches. A mob of at least 50 men, many with handkerchiefs tied over their faces, was marching toward the jail. They carried rifles, clubs, and ropes. "Get him out!" someone screamed. "Hang the rustler!" Nora's blood froze. They were not waiting for the judge. They were not waiting for morning. She did not think. She did not grab her coat. She ran out of the room in her dress, her hair loose, her feet stumbling on the stairs. She burst out of the boarding house and into the freezing street. The mob was already at the jail. She saw the door smashed open. She saw Sheriff Miller standing to the side, his hands raised in a pantomime of helplessness, letting the men stream past him. "No!" Nora screamed, running toward them. She was small, and the crowd was dense, but she fought her way through them like a wild thing. She elbowed men in the ribs, ducked under swinging arms, and shoved her way to the steps. They were dragging Eli out. He was fighting them. His hands were tied, but he was kicking and thrashing. A lion brought down by hyenas. His face was bloody. A man hit him in the stomach with a rifle butt, and he doubled over, gasping. Nora threw herself at the men holding him. "Let him go!" she shrieked, clawing at a masked face. "Get her out of here!" a voice roared. A rough hand grabbed Nora's hair, yanking her back. She spun around and bit the hand. Hard. The man yelped and let go. Nora scrambled back to Eli, wrapping her arms around his waist, shielding his body with her own. She turned to face the mob, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. "You want to hang him?" she screamed, her voice cutting through the noise. "Then you have to hang me too." The crowd wavered. The sight of a woman, a white woman, her hair wild, clinging to the condemned man, gave them pause. The frontier had a code, twisted though it was. You did not lynch women. "Move aside, girl," a man in a flour sack mask shouted. "This is not your business." "It is my business," Nora yelled back. "He is innocent. You are all cowards. You are doing the dirty work for a man who is too scared to show his face." She scanned the crowd, looking for the expensive coat, the pale eyes. "Where are you? Thomas," she screamed. "Come out and kill us yourself." A figure on a horse near the back pushed forward. It was Thomas, his mask hanging loose around his neck. His face was twisted with drink and fury. "She is lying," Thomas shouted, his voice slurring. "She is a whore. She belongs to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. "She belongs to me." Even the drunkest men in the mob paused. That was not the talk of justice. That was the talk of a grudge. Eli felt the hesitation. He felt the grip of the men holding him loosen just a fraction as they looked at Thomas. He did not waste the second. "Nora, move!" Eli roared. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling backward behind a wooden water trough. In the same motion, he threw his body weight against the man to his right. The man stumbled. Eli brought his tied hands up and smashed them into the man's nose. Bone crunched. The man dropped his rifle. Eli dove for the weapon. His fingers closed around the cold steel of the barrel. "Gun!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted. A shot rang out, wild and deafening. Then another. The horses reared, screaming. Men scrambled for cover, diving behind wagons and barrels. "Get to the horses!" Eli yelled. Scrambling to his feet, he didn't try to shoot. He used the rifle as a club, swinging it into the gut of a deputy who tried to grab him. He reached Nora, grabbing her arm and hauling her up. "Run!" They sprinted toward the hitching rail where the mob's horses were tied. The air was filled with smoke and shouting. Another shot cracked, and Nora heard the whistle of the bullet past her ear. Near the jail steps, a young boy, no more than 16, a farmhand who had come just to see the excitement, suddenly crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg, screaming for his mother. The mob froze for a split second, shocked by the sight of their own blood. Eli grabbed the reins of a loose horse, a tall roan. He swung up, not bothering with stirrups, and reached down for Nora. "Jump!" She grasped his forearm. He pulled, his strength fueled by adrenaline, and swung her up behind him. "Hold on!" He kicked the horse. The animal surged forward, crashing through the line of men. A hand grabbed at Nora's skirt, tearing the fabric, but she kicked out, her heel connecting with a jaw. They broke through the circle of torchlight and galloped into the darkness. Behind them, shouts of pursuit rose up. Gunfire sparked in the night, uselessly chasing them. Eli did not look back. He drove the horse hard, turning off the main road and heading straight for the open range. The wind hit them instantly. A wall of ice. Snow began to fall. Not the gentle flakes of a Christmas card, but hard, driving pellets that stung like buckshot. "We have to make the foothills," Eli shouted over the wind. "There is a line shack near the crest. It is the only cover." They rode into the teeth of the blizzard. The world dissolved into white and black. The cold was instant and paralyzing. Nora wrapped her arms around Eli's waist, pressing her face into his back, feeling the muscles bunch and release as he guided the terrified horse. They rode for hours. The horse began to stumble, its chest heaving. The snow was knee-deep now, drifting against the sagebrush. Finally, a dark shape loomed out of the swirling white, a low sod-roofed shack, half buried in a drift. Eli pulled the horse up. He slid off, his legs buckling as they hit the ground. He caught himself on the saddle. Inside, he gasped. He helped Nora down. She was numb, her movements sluggish. They stumbled to the door. It was frozen shut. Eli threw his shoulder against it. Once, twice. The wood splintered, and the door gave way. They fell inside. The shack was tiny, smelling of dry rotten rats, but it was out of the wind. Eli turned back, dragging the heavy door shut and jamming a piece of broken furniture against it. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the dirt floor. His breathing was ragged, a harsh rasp in the darkness. Nora fumbled in her pocket for a match. She found one, struck it against the stone wall. The flare of light blinded her for a second. She saw a small pile of dry wood in the corner. She crawled to it, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped the match. She fed the flame to some dry moss and twigs. Fire, as the small blaze caught, casting long, jumping shadows on the walls. The reality of what had happened crashed down on them. They were alive, but they were fugitives. They were freezing, and they were alone. Eli looked at her across the fire. His face was a mask of blood and soot. The ropes were still dangling from his wrists, though he had managed to work the knots loose during the ride. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a ghost. "No," Nora whispered. I will live." He began to untie the ropes completely, wincing as the blood rushed back into his hands. Nora watched him. The fear that had kept her moving was evaporating, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming anger. "Why did you shove me?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Behind the trough?" Eli looked up, surprised by the tone. "To get you out of the line of fire. You tried to make me leave. In the jail. You tried to send me away. I was trying to save your life." Eli shouted back, the anger flaring in him too. "Do you have any idea how close we came to dying?" "I do not care about dying," Nora screamed. Standing up, she was trembling, but not from cold. "I care about being pushed away. You treat me like I am something fragile, like I am something dirty that you have to protect from yourself." Eli stood up, wincing. "That is not true. It is true. Every time we get close, you pull back. You look at me, and then you look away like you cannot stand the sight of me. Is it because of Thomas? Is it because of the others? Do I disgust you? Eli, is that it?" She was crying now, hot, angry tears. "Am I just the whore you rescued?" Eli stared at her. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. He saw the pain in her eyes, the deep, festering wound of her self-worth. He crossed the small space between them in a single stride. He grabbed her arms, not gently. "Disgust me?" he rasped. "You think you disgust me?" He shook her once. "I am terrified." "Nora," the confession tore out of him. "I look at you, and I see the only thing in this world that makes me want to live. And that scares me to death, because everyone I love dies. Everyone I touch burns." He stared down at her, his gray eyes wild and vulnerable. "I pushed you away because I wanted to keep you safe from me. Not because you are dirty, because you are. You are everything." Nora went still. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a shock wave of understanding. He didn't hate her past. He feared his own future. "Eli," she whispered. He did not wait. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the crash of two desperate, starving things finally finding sustenance. It tasted of blood, smoke, and snow. Nora made a sound in her throat and threw her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own. She wanted to erase the cold. She wanted to erase the fear. She wanted to mark him as hers. Eli groaned, his hands tangling in her hair, his body pressing her back against the rough log wall. The barrier he had built for months crumbled into dust. Too big, he murmured against her mouth. The words, a broken prayer. I cannot hold back anymore. Then do not, Nora breathed. Just sit tight. She pulled him down to the dirt floor, onto the pile of old blankets and straw. The storm howled outside, beating against the walls, but inside, the fire was consuming them. They undressed with frantic hands, kneading skin against skin. When Eli touched her, his hands shaking, there was no hesitation. He touched her scars with reverence. He traced the line of her hip, the curve of her breast, as if he were memorizing a map of salvation. Nora felt the weight of him, heavy, solid, real. She felt the power she had sensed on the horse, but now it was directed at her, not with violence, but with a desperate, consuming need. When they finally joined, it was a revelation. It was not the transaction Nora had known in the brothel. It was not taking, it was giving. It was a reclaiming of her own body, a declaration that she belonged to no one but this man, and he belonged to no one but her. They moved together in the flickering light, the world outside ceasing to exist. Nora cried out, not in pain, but in release, the sound mingling with the wind. Eli buried his face in her neck, holding onto her as if she were the only solid thing in a universe of chaos. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the dusty blankets, their breathing slowly synchronizing with the crackle of the dying fire. Eli's arm was draped over her, his hand resting protectively on her stomach. Nora rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the storm. She felt raw, open, and utterly new. The shame that had followed her for years was gone, burned away by the heat of his touch. She was not ruined. She was chosen. Eli kissed the top of her head. We cannot run, he said quietly into the dark. Nora shifted to look at him. No, if we run, they win. They will hunt us down. We will always be looking over our shoulders. So what do? We go back, Eli said, his voice hardening. We go back when the storm breaks. We ride right down Main Street. We find the circuit judge, and we tell the truth. All of it, even about Thomas? Nora asked. Especially about Thomas. He tightened his arm around her. I am done hiding. Nora, I am done being afraid of the fire. Let them look. Let them see us. Nora rested her hand on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart. She knew what it would cost. She knew the whispers would never truly stop. But as she lay there in the line shack, sheltered from the blizzard by the man she loved, she knew she could weather any storm. We go back, she agreed, together. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world scoured and silent. The wind, which had howled like a living thing for hours, finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a stillness that felt brittle, as if the very air might shatter. Nora Hayes stepped out of the line shack into a landscape of blinding white. The snow had drifted deep against the sagebrush, smoothing the jagged edges of the high plains into deceptive, rolling softness. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against her lungs, freezing the moisture in her nose instantly. Eli McCrae followed her, blinking against the glare. He looked older this morning. The lines around his eyes were etched deeper, and his movements were stiff, the cold settling into his bad leg. But there was a new steadiness in him, a resolve that had replaced the frantic energy of the night before. We should move, Eli said, his voice scratching the silence. The horses will freeze if we keep them standing, and I want to be in town before noon. They mounted the roan horse together, Eli in the saddle, Nora behind him with her arms wrapped tight around his waist. The warmth of his body was the only thing keeping the shivering at bay. As they rode down from the foothills, the snow crunched loudly under the horses' hooves, marking their passage back to the world they had fled. Each mile that brought them closer to Cottonwood Springs tightened the knot in Nora's stomach. She rested her cheek against Eli's heavy coat, listening to the rhythm of his heart, wondering if it would be the last time she heard it beat. They were riding back into the lion's den, armed with nothing but the truth, and she knew well enough that truth was a poor shield against a bullet. 3 miles outside of town, where the road narrowed between 2 ridges of red rock, they saw a buggy approaching. Eli pulled the roan up, his hand dropping instinctively to the rifle he had stolen during the escape. Nora stiffened, peering around his shoulder. "It is the doctor," Eli said, lowering the weapon slightly. Doctor. Henry Stanton was a man worn thin by the territory. He sat hunched in his buggy, wrapped in a buffalo robe, his face gray and drawn. Beside him sat Martha Gable, a rancher's wife whose face was as weathered and tough as cured leather. She held a basket on her lap and a shotgun leaning against her knee. "Doctor." Stanton pulled his horse to a halt as they drew near. He looked at Eli, then at Nora, his eyes weary behind his spectacles. "I heard you were dead," Stanton said, his voice flat. "Or halfway to Mexico." "Not yet," Eli answered. "We are going back, Henry, to see the judge." Stanton sighed, a puff of white steam escaping his lips. "You might want to turn around, Eli. The town is a powder keg. That boy, Caleb Miller, the farmhand who took a bullet last night, he is still breathing, but barely. His brother Jacob is tearing the town apart looking for you. He thinks you shot him. I did not shoot him," Eli said. "I never fired a shot. I know that," Stanton said. "And Martha here knows it. We saw the angle. The shot came from the jail porch. It was one of the deputies, likely aiming for you and missing wide. But truth does not matter much when the blood is hot." Martha Gable shifted the shotgun, looking up at Eli with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Thomas Alder has been buying drinks all morning," she said, her voice raspy. "Telling everyone you are a mad dog, telling them you kidnapped this girl and forced her to run. He is trying to get them to finish what they started before the circuit judge gets settled." "The judge is there?" Nora asked, hope flaring in her chest. "He rode in an hour ago." Stanton nodded. "Judge Blackwood. He is a hard man, Nora. He does not suffer fools, and he does not like lynching, but he also does not like rustlers." "I am not a rustler," Eli said. "Then you better ride in there and prove it," Stanton said, before they burn the town down out of spite. "Will you stand with us?" Nora asked suddenly. Her voice was small in the cold air, but clear. "You know Thomas. You know what he is. You have treated the women he has hurt." Stanton looked at Martha. They exchanged a long, silent look, a communication born of years watching their town rot from the inside out. "I set the bone on a girl 3 years ago," Stanton said quietly. "She worked at the laundry, said she fell down the stairs, but the bruises were in the shape of a man's hand. Thomas Alder paid her medical bill." Martha spat over the side of the buggy. "He tried to buy my north pasture last year. When my husband said no, our barn caught fire 2 days later. We never proved it, but we knew. We are going to the judge," Eli said. "We are going to tell him everything." Stanton snapped the reins of his buggy. "Then tie your horse to the back. Eli, you look like hell. Walking in with the doctor might buy you 5 minutes before the shooting starts." Cottonwood Springs felt like a held breath. The main street was eerily empty. The snow trampled into gray slush by many boots, but the sidewalks were clear. Eyes watched from behind curtained windows. The silence was heavy, charged with the static of violence waiting for a spark. When the doctor's buggy rolled up to the saloon, which had been commandeered as the makeshift courthouse, the doors swung open. Sheriff Miller stepped out, his arm in a sling from the chaos of the night before. He looked pale and sweating, pain making his eyes mean. When he saw Eli climb down from the buggy, his hand went to his holster. "Do not do it. Miller," Stanton shouted, climbing down quickly. "I've got Judge Blackwood inside. You shoot a man in my custody, and you will hang for it." Miller hesitated, his hand hovering over his gun. The door behind him opened wider, and a tall man in a black frock coat stepped out. Judge Thaddeus Blackwood looked like a hawk carved from granite. He had a mane of silver hair and eyes that seemed to drill straight through a man's skull. He looked at Miller, then at Eli, then at the gathering crowd that was beginning to spill out of the alleys. "Is this the prisoner?" Blackwood asked, his voice booming like a canyon echo. "He is an escaped fugitive." "Your Honor," Miller spat, "I should shoot him where he stands." "He is surrendering," Blackwood said coldly, "which means he is under the protection of this court. Bring him inside, and bring the woman. I want to hear what she has to say before you lot decide to tear my jurisdiction apart." The saloon was packed to bursting. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, smelling of wet wool, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. The tables had been pushed together to form a bench, behind which Judge Blackwood sat like a king on a throne of rough pine. Thomas Alder sat in the front row, his suit impeccable, his face composed into a mask of righteous indignation. When Nora walked in, his eyes flickered toward her, cold, possessive, and promising pain. Nora took her seat beside Eli on a wooden bench. She felt small. She felt dirty. The whispers started instantly, a low buzzing sound like angry hornets. "That is her. Look at her dress, torn to ribbons. Shameless." Eli reached out and took her hand. He did not look at the crowd. He looked straight ahead at the judge. His grip was iron hard, anchoring her to the earth. "Order," Blackwood shouted, slamming a gavel onto the table. "This is a court of law, not a bear pit. The next man who speaks out of turn will spend a month in the territorial prison." The room fell silent. Sheriff Miller presented the charges: cattle rustling, grand larceny, jailbreak, and assault on an officer. He spoke with a practiced smoothness, painting Eli as a desperate, violent man who had been terrorizing the county. When it was Eli's turn, he stood up. He did not shout. He did not plead. He spoke with the quiet, devastating simplicity of a man who has nothing left to lose. "I did not steal those calves," Eli said. "They were planted, and I did not break out of jail to escape justice. I broke out because a mob was coming to hang me, led by that man there." He pointed a steady finger at Thomas. Thomas jumped up. "Objection. Your Honor, this man is a liar and a murderer. He is trying to shift the blame." "Sit down, Mr. Alder," Blackwood snapped. "You are a witness, not the prosecutor." Then the judge turned his gaze to Nora. "Miss Hayes," he said, "step forward." Nora stood. Her legs felt like water. She walked to the witness chair, a rickety stool placed in front of the judge. She could feel Thomas's eyes boring into her back. She could feel the judgment of the townswomen, their faces pinched with disapproval. She took the oath, her hand trembling on the Bible. "Tell me what happened." "Miss Hayes," Blackwood said, "start from the beginning. Why were you with the accused?" Nora took a breath. She looked at Eli. He nodded. "Just once." She looked at the crowd. She saw the faces of the men who had jeered at her in the street. She saw the women who had pulled their skirts aside. "I was with him because he hired me," she said, her voice shaking at first, then gaining strength. "He hired me because no one else in this town would give me decent work." "And why is that?" Blackwood asked. "Because of where I came from," Nora said. "Tell the court. I worked in a brothel in Denver," Nora said clearly. A gasp went through the room. The whispers hissed up again. "My father died in debt," she continued, not stopping. "He signed a paper that sold my labor to the house. I was there for 2 years." "And how did you come to be here?" Blackwood asked. "Thomas Alder brought me here," she said. Thomas stood up again, his face red. "Lies! I never—" "Sit down!" Blackwood roared. "Continue. Miss Hayes." "He came to the house in Denver," Nora said, looking directly at Thomas now. "He was a regular. He liked to hurt the girls. He paid extra for it." The silence in the room changed. It was no longer judgmental. It was shocked. Thomas Alder was the banker's son. He was respectable. "He paid the madam to have me sent here," Nora said. "He told me he had work for me. But when I arrived, he told me I owed him for the train ticket. He told me I belonged to him until the debt was paid. He tried to force me. He tried to hurt me in the alley behind the boarding house." She touched her throat, remembering the feel of his hands. He told me no one would believe me because of what I was. He told the sheriff to arrest me if I tried to leave. She looked at Sheriff Miller. Miller was staring at his boots, refusing to meet anyone's eye. "Mr. McCrae saved me," Nora said softly. "He paid the debt. He paid $50 in gold to buy my freedom. He took me in when no one else would. He treated me with respect. And because he protected me, Thomas Alder decided to destroy him." She stopped. The room was deadly quiet. Thomas Alder was standing, his hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him. His composure was cracking. The mask was slipping. "She is a whore!" Thomas shouted, his voice shrill. "You are going to take the word of a whore over a businessman? She is lying to save her lover. Doctor!" Stanton stood up from the back of the room. "She is not lying about the bruises." "Thomas," the doctor said loudly. "I treated a girl 3 years ago, Mary Ellen. You remember her? She had the same marks on her throat. You paid her $50 to leave town, and my barn," Martha Gable shouted, standing up beside the doctor. "You burned my barn when we would not sell." "You are a snake. Thomas Alder, order!" Blackwood hammered the gavel. But the tide had turned. The townspeople were looking at Thomas now, really looking at him. They saw the sweat on his upper lip. They saw the vein throbbing in his temple. They saw the ugliness that Nora had exposed. Judge Blackwood turned to Eli. "Mr. McCrae," he said, "you claim the calves were planted. Do you have proof?" "I have the proof of my own eyes," Eli said, standing slowly. "And the proof of history. This is not the first time the Alders have tried to take my land." He took a step forward, his voice breaking with a raw, jagged pain. 5 years ago, Thomas's father wanted my water rights. I said no. A week later, my house burned down in the middle of the night. Eli stopped, swallowing hard. The room waited. "My wife, Sarah, was inside," he whispered, "and my son, William, he was 4 months old." Nora covered her mouth with her hand. She saw tears standing in the eyes of the women in the front row. "It was ruled an accident," Eli said, his voice rising, shaking with fury. "But the doors were barred from the outside. I found the timber wedged against the frame. It was no accident. It was murder. And now the son is doing what the father did. He wants to crush me because I stood up to him, because I took something he thought he owned." He pointed at Nora. "She is not property. Alder, she is a human being. And she is worth 10 of you," Thomas snapped. The veneer of civilization that he wore like a suit finally shattered. He kicked the chair over, crashing it to the floor. "She is mine," Thomas screamed, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of hate. "I paid for her. I bought her. She is nothing but spoiled goods. And you dirt farming cripple. You do not deserve land. You do not deserve a family. You deserve to burn just like your whore wife did." The confession hung in the air, vibrating in the silence. Thomas froze. He realized too late what he had screamed. He looked around the room, seeing the horror on the faces of the people he had manipulated. He saw the judge writing furiously in his ledger. I did not mean," he stammered. "Sit down, Mr. Alder," Judge Blackwood said. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. "Sheriff Miller, take Mr. Alder into custody." Sheriff Miller looked at Thomas. He looked at the judge. He looked at the angry crowd. He did not move. "I said, take him into custody," Blackwood barked. Miller reached for his handcuffs, but Thomas backed away. "No," Thomas shouted. "You cannot do this to me. My father owns this town." He turned and bolted for the door. "Stop him," the judge yelled. But the crowd was in confusion. Men were shouting. Chairs were overturning. Thomas Alder shoved his way through the press of bodies and vanished into the street. "We have to catch him," Eli said, grabbing Nora's hand, "before he does something crazy." Night fell like a shroud over Cottonwood Springs. The judge had declared a recess, ordering a manhunt for Thomas Alder. The town was buzzing, groups of men patrolling the alleys with lanterns. Eli and Nora sat in the doctor's office, drinking hot coffee laced with brandy. "It is over," Nora said, though she did not feel the relief she expected. Everyone heard him. "It is not over until he is in a cell," Eli said grimly. He is cornered. A cornered rat bites. Suddenly, a shout rose up from the street. Fire! Fire at the livery! Eli dropped his cup. It shattered on the floor. The horses! He shouted. He ran out the door, Nora close on his heels. The livery stable at the end of the street was already engulfed. Flames licked up the dry timber walls, roaring into the night sky. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking, carrying the terrified screams of trapped horses. My horses are in there, Eli yelled, sprinting toward the inferno. Townspeople were rushing from their homes, carrying buckets, forming a line from the water trough. But the fire was moving too fast. Eli did not stop. He grabbed a wet blanket from a water barrel and threw it over his head. Eli, no! Nora screamed, grabbing his coat. You will die in there! Ranger is in there! Eli shouted, pulling away. He plunged into the smoke. Nora did not think. She could not stand on the street and watch him burn. She grabbed a bucket, dumped the water over her own head and shoulders, and ran after him. Inside the barn, the heat was a physical hammer. The air was filled with flying sparks and falling embers. The horses were kicking their stalls, wild with terror. Eli was at the far end, struggling with the latch on Ranger's stall. The metal was hot, searing his hands. He got the door open, slapping the stallion on the rump. Go, get out! Ranger bolted, knocking Eli sideways, galloping toward the open doors and safety. Eli turned to the next stall. Bess was in there, whinnying shrilly. Nora reached him, coughing in the thick smoke. Help me, Eli yelled. Together, they threw the latch. Nora grabbed the mare's halter, pulling her out of the stall, guiding her toward the light. Get the others, Eli roared. They worked frantically, freeing the other horses as the roof groaned overhead. A burning beam crashed down, blocking the main aisle. They had to drive the last two horses out the back door into the corral. They stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping, their faces blackened with soot, their lungs burning. The barn was a lost cause. The flames were consuming the structure entirely now, lighting up the town like a second sun. Eli bent over, hands on his knees, coughing violently. Nora stood beside him, patting his back, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. You fool, she choked out. You brave, stupid fool. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the corral. It was Jacob Miller, the older brother of the farmhand who had been shot the night before. He was a big man, slow of speech but quick to anger. In his hands, he held a double-barreled shotgun. He pointed it straight at Eli's chest. You shot my brother, Jacob said, his voice shaking with grief. Caleb is dying. And now you burn the town. Jacob, no! Nora screamed, stepping in front of Eli. Get out of the way. Woman, Jacob warned, cocking the hammers. This is justice. Eli gently pushed Nora behind him. He stood tall, holding his hands out, palms open. I did not shoot Caleb. Jacob, you know me. I have never heard a man who did not come at me first. Thomas Alder told me, Jacob shouted. He told me you did it. He said you laughed about it. From the darkness behind the water trough, a voice laughed, a high, thin, hysterical sound. Thomas Alder stepped into the flickering light of the fire. He held a revolver in his hand, but it was wavering. His suit was torn, his hair wild. He looked completely insane. Finish him! Jacob! Thomas yelled. Kill him! He ruined everything. He took the woman. He took the land. Kill him and I will give you the ranch. I will give you anything. Jacob hesitated. He looked at Thomas, then back at Eli. He saw the fear in Thomas's eyes. He saw the calm resignation in Eli's. And he saw something else. He saw Nora, clinging to Eli's arm, ready to die with him. He is lying to you, Jacob, Eli said softly, just like he lied to everyone else. He used your brother to start a riot, and now he is using you to commit a murder. Do not listen to him, Thomas screamed. Shoot him, or I will shoot you. Thomas raised his pistol, aiming not at Eli, but at Jacob. Panic erupted. Jacob saw the gun turn toward him. Instinct took over. He spun around, the shotgun roaring. Boom! The blast was deafening. Thomas Alder was thrown backward as if kicked by a mule. The charge of buckshot caught him squarely in the chest. He hit the dirt and did not move. Simultaneously, Thomas's pistol went off. The bullet went wide, sparking off a metal bucket and grazing Sheriff Miller in the leg as he came running around the corner of the burning barn. Miller went down with a yelp. Then, silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the men. Jacob lowered the shotgun, smoke drifting from the barrels. He stared at the body of Thomas Alder. He looked like a man waking up from a nightmare. I didn't mean, Jacob stammered. He was going to shoot me. Judge Blackwood stepped into the circle of light. He looked at the body. He looked at Jacob. He looked at Eli and Nora. It was self-defense, the judge said loudly, his voice carrying over the crowd. I saw it. We all saw it. Jacob dropped the shotgun and fell to his knees, burying his face in his hands. Eli put his arm around Nora. She was trembling against him, burying her face in his coat to hide from the sight of the dead man. It is over, Eli whispered into her hair. It is finally over. The sun rose on a changed world. The livery barn was a pile of smoldering ash, the smell of wet charcoal hanging heavy over the town. The body of Thomas Alder had been moved to the undertaker's. Sheriff Miller was in the jailhouse cell, his leg bandaged, awaiting transport to the territorial capital for corruption charges. Judge Blackwood sat in the saloon, finishing his paperwork. He called Eli and Nora to his table. The charges against you are dismissed, Mr. McCrae, the judge said, stamping a document. The testimony regarding the planted cattle has been corroborated by 2 of the deputies who decided to save their own skins. Thank you, Judge, Eli said. However, the judge continued, looking over his spectacles, this town is broken. Thomas Alder is dead, but his money and his influence ran deep. The bank will likely foreclose on half the businesses here once the books are audited. And the people, well, people do not forgive easily when they have been shown to be fools. He looked at Nora. I'm sorry. Miss Hayes, you spoke bravely, but courage does not always buy respect. There are many here who will still blame you for the violence. They will say if you had never come, Thomas Alder would still be alive and the boy Caleb would not be crippled. I know, Nora said quietly. I saw their faces this morning. Caleb Miller would live, but the doctor said he would never walk without a crutch. His brother Jacob was free, but he was a broken man, haunted by the fact that he had been a pawn in his brother's injury. We cannot stay here, Eli said. No, the judge agreed. I do not think you can. Eli and Nora walked out into the street. The wind was blowing again, cold and biting. People watched them pass. There were no jeers now, but there were no smiles either. Just a cold, hard silence. The women turned their backs. The men spat on the ground. Nora realized with a sinking heart that the judge was right. She had been vindicated by the law, but she was condemned by the culture. To them, she would always be the whore who burned down the town. Eli stopped by the hitching post where Ranger and Bess were tied. He looked at Nora. He reached out and brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. We sell the herd, he said. We take the money. And we go, where? Nora asked. Somewhere where the wind does not blow so hard, Eli said. Somewhere where no one knows our names. He looked toward the mountains in the west, pristine and white against the blue sky. There is a valley I saw once, he said, way up high, hard to get to, but the grass is green, and the water is free. Nora looked at the mountains. She looked at the town that would never accept her. Then she looked at Eli, scarred, tired, but standing tall. Take me there, she said. Eli nodded. He helped her onto her horse, his hands lingering on her waist. Let us go home. Nora. They rode out of Cottonwood Springs without looking back, leaving the ashes and the ghosts behind them, riding toward the white peaks and the unknown future. The weeks that followed the burning of the livery stable were defined not by noise, but by a suffocating quiet. Cottonwood Springs was a town trying to forget. Judge Blackwood departed on the morning stagecoach 3 days after the inquest, taking with him a heavy leather satchel filled with ledgers that detailed the fraudulent empire of Thomas Alder. With the judge went the immediate fear of the law, leaving behind a vacuum that the townspeople rushed to fill with a desperate, hurried normalcy. A temporary sheriff was appointed, a man named Silas Reed, who had been a freighter before his knees gave out. Reed was a tired man who spent his days trying to organize the chaos left in the wake of the fire and the arrests. He had no interest in enforcing the moral code of the church ladies or chasing down rumors about the rancher and his housekeeper. He was too busy trying to keep the peace between the creditors who were now descending on the bank like vultures on a carcass. For Eli McCrae, the law had spoken. His name was cleared. The charges of rustling were expunged from the record, dismissed as the fabrications of a dead man. But Eli knew, and Nora knew, that a gavel banging on a table did not change the way a man looked at you when you walked into a room. Nora felt it every time she rode into town for supplies. She walked down the boardwalk, her head held high, refusing to scurry like a frightened mouse. But the reaction was always the same. Conversations on the porch of the general store would die abruptly as she approached. Women would gather their skirts and turn their backs, studying the display of calico in the window with intense fascination until she passed. It was not the open hostility of the mob. It was colder than that. It was a shunning. It was a collective decision that while Nora Hayes might not be a criminal, she was a reminder of things they did not want to see. She was the mirror that reflected their own cowardice and their own complicity in Thomas Alder's reign. One afternoon, Nora came out of the dry goods store carrying a sack of flour. Two women were standing near the hitching post, Mrs. Higgins, her former employer at the boarding house, and the baker's wife. "Good afternoon. Mrs. Higgins," Nora said, pausing. Mrs. Higgins looked at Nora. Her eyes were not angry, but they were empty. She looked through Nora as if she were made of glass, then turned to her companion. "It looks like rain today." "Martha," Mrs. Higgins said, "we should get the laundry in." They walked away, leaving Nora standing alone in the dusty street, the sack of flour heavy in her arms. She realized then that justice in the books was a cold comfort when the heart of the town was closed to her. She could live here for 50 years. She could save a dozen children from a burning schoolhouse. It would not matter. To them, she would always be the woman who brought the fire. When she returned to the ranch, Eli was waiting on the porch. He was repairing a bridle, his large hands working the leather with a slow, meditative rhythm. He saw the set of her jaw, the shadow in her eyes. He did not ask what had happened. He knew. He set the bridle down and looked out across the brown pasture, toward the jagged line of the mountains in the west. "We could sell," he said quietly. Nora stopped on the bottom step. She looked at him. "Sell? The herd is small, but the beef prices are up," Eli said. "And the land. It is good land, despite the drought. Doctor, Stanton has been looking for a place. He and Martha have been talking about expanding their practice, maybe doing something for the widows and strays the territory leaves behind." He looked at her then, his gray eyes steady and serious. "There is a valley. Nora, way up north, near the Wyoming line. I passed through it once, years ago, before I settled here. It is high up, the winters are hard, but the water comes straight off the snowpack, clear as gin. The grass grows up to your stirrups." Nora felt a tightening in her chest. "Is there a town?" "Not for 3 days' ride," Eli said. "Just the mountains and the sky." He stood up and walked down the steps to stand in front of her. "I am tired of watching you bleed every time you go into that town. Nora, I am tired of the air here. It tastes like smoke." Nora looked at the ground. She kicked a pebble with the toe of her boot. "If we leave," she whispered, "are we running, or are we just cowards?" Eli reached out and lifted her chin with his finger. "A coward runs from a fight," he said. "We fought. We won. Now we are just choosing where we want to plant our corn. There is no shame in seeking clean ground." Nora thought about the valley he described. She thought about a place where no one knew the name Thomas Alder, where no one knew about the room with the red curtains. "I need to do one thing first," she said. The next day, Nora rode to the edge of town, to the small clapboard house where the doctor had set up a recovery ward. Caleb Miller, the young farmhand who had been shot in the crossfire, was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair. His leg was splinted and wrapped in thick bandages. He looked pale and thin, little more than a boy, his eyes haunted by the violence he had seen. When he saw Nora approach, he stopped rocking. He gripped the arms of the chair. Nora dismounted and tied Bess to the rail. She walked up the path, her heart hammering. She expected anger. She expected him to shout at her for the ruin of his leg. "Caleb," she said softly. "Miss Hayes," he rasped. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I am mending," he said. "Doc says I will limp, but I will walk." There was a silence between them, filled with the buzzing of flies. "I am sorry, Caleb," Nora said. "If I hadn't—" "Don't," Caleb interrupted. He looked at her, his young face solemn. "You didn't pull the trigger, and you didn't start the fire." He looked down at his bandaged leg. "My brother, Jacob, told me what happened. In the barn. He told me Thomas tried to make him kill Eli. He told me you stood in front of him." He looked back up at her, and his eyes were clear. "Thank you, Miss Hayes, for telling the truth in that saloon. If you hadn't, Thomas would still be running things, and my brother might have become a murderer for him." "You stopped it." Nora felt a lump rise in her throat. She had expected blame. She had found grace. "Take care of yourself, Caleb," she whispered. She rode back to the ranch with a lighter heart. Caleb's forgiveness did not change the town's cruelty, but it freed her from the guilt she had been carrying. She realized that leaving wasn't about running away from her past. It was about running toward a future where that past didn't define every breath she took. They sold the ranch 2 weeks later. Dr. Stanton and his wife came out with the papers. They sat at the rough table in the cabin, drinking Eli's bitter coffee. "We are going to turn the main house into a dormitory, Mrs. Stanton said, her eyes shining with a vision of the future. "There are so many children in the mining camps who have lost their parents, and women who have nowhere to go when their husbands die or leave. This will be a sanctuary." Nora watched them sign the deed. She saw the way the doctor looked at the land, not with the greedy eyes of Thomas Alder, but with the hopeful eyes of a healer. It felt right. The place where Eli had suffered so much loss, where they had fought so hard to survive, would become a place of safety for others. The soil would be turned over, and new seeds would be planted. When the money was counted out, a heavy sack of gold and bank drafts, Eli handed the keys to the doctor. "The roof leaks in a heavy rain," Eli said, "and the stove draws smoke if the wind is from the east." "We will fix it," Stanton said, shaking Eli's hand. "Good luck, Eli. You deserve some peace." Nora packed her few belongings into the saddlebags. She took the small Bible her mother had given her, the few clothes she owned, and the memory of the night in the lion shack. They rode out at dawn. They did not look back at the town. They turned their horses north and west, toward the blue wall of the mountains. The journey was not an escape. It was a trial. The land between Cottonwood Springs and the high valley was a gauntlet of sun-baked plains, thorny ravines, and rivers swollen with snowmelt. They traveled for weeks, moving slowly, conserving the strength of the horses. The sun beat down on them with a relentless, hammering weight. Nora's skin turned a deep, golden brown, and her hair bleached lighter in the glare. Her lips cracked from the wind, which never seemed to stop blowing. It carried the grit of the desert, scouring their faces until it felt like the skin was being peeled away. They faced rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of the sagebrush, their dry warning rattles sending the horses into panic. They endured a sudden, violent hailstorm that battered them with stones the size of robins' eggs, forcing them to cower under their saddles for an hour while the sky tried to stone them to death. But through the hardship, there was a quiet joy. They were alone. There were no whispers, no judging eyes. Just the two of them and the vast, indifferent sky. As the weeks turned into a month, Nora began to notice a change. It started with a subtle shift in her appetite. The smell of salt pork frying in the morning, which used to make her mouth water, now turned her stomach. She found herself craving the sourness of wild berries and the cold clarity of creek water. Then came the tenderness. Her breasts felt heavy, sore to the touch of her shift. and the monthly bleeding, which had been as regular as the moon, did not come. She knew. She rode in silence, her hand drifting to her stomach whenever Eli was scouting ahead. A mix of terror and wonder swirled in her gut. A child. She thought of her own childhood, the instability, the gambling, the fear. She thought of Eli's loss, the fire, the tiny body he had buried. She was afraid to tell him. She was afraid that the shadow of his past would rise up and swallow this new hope. She watched him at night, staring into the fire, and wondered if he was seeing the faces of his dead wife and son in the flames. They reached the foothills of the Great Range in late summer. The air grew thinner, crisper. The sagebrush gave way to pine and spruce. One night, they made camp on a high ridge. The sky was a canopy of crushed velvet, thick with stars that looked close enough to touch. The Milky Way was a river of light spilled across the darkness. They ate their beans in silence. Eli was cleaning his rifle. The rhythmic click-clack of the mechanism, the only sound in the vastness. Eli. Nora said. Her voice was soft, but it made him look up instantly. I need to tell you something. Eli set the rifle down. He looked at her face, illuminated by the dancing firelight. He saw the hesitation, the fear in her eyes. What is it? Is it the mare? Is she lame? No, Nora said, it is me. She took a deep breath, her hand resting on her belly. I have missed my time. Eli, 2 months now. And I feel different. Eli went still. He stared at her hand on her stomach. His face went completely blank, drained of all expression. You are sure, he whispered. I am sure. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, abruptly, he stood up. He turned away from the fire and walked out into the darkness. Eli, Nora called, panic rising in her throat. He did not answer. He kept walking until he was just a shadow against the stars. Nora sat by the fire, tears stinging her eyes. She had known it. He was thinking of the fire. He was thinking of the pain of losing a child. He was regretting everything. He was regretting her. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. She was alone again. Even here, in the middle of nowhere. She was alone. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The fire burned down to coals. Then she heard footsteps. Eli walked back into the circle of light. He looked wretched. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale. He looked like a man who had wrestled with a demon and barely survived. He walked straight to her and dropped to his knees in the dirt. He reached out, his hands trembling violently. He placed them over her hands, covering her stomach. His palms were rough, calloused, and incredibly warm. I am terrified. Nora, he choked out. He looked up at her, and the raw vulnerability in his face broke her heart. I walked out there, and all I could see was the smoke. All I could hear was the sound of the roof coming down. I thought if I love this child, the world will take it, just to punish me. He squeezed her hands. But then I thought about you. I thought about how you rode that horse across the flood. I thought about you standing in front of that mob. He leaned his forehead against her knees. I want this. Nora, God help me. I want this child more than I have ever wanted anything. I am scared to death, but I am done running. He looked up, his eyes fierce with a new promise. I will not hide behind the guilt anymore. I will protect you. I will protect this baby. If the fire comes again, I will put it out. Nora leaned forward and kissed his forehead, her tears falling into his hair. We will put it out together, she whispered. They found the valley 3 days later. It was exactly as Eli had described. Only better. It was a hidden jewel, tucked between towering granite peaks that acted as a fortress against the world. A clear, singing creek cut through the center of a lush meadow. Fed by the glaciers above, tall ponderosa pines climbed the slopes, singing in the wind. The land was raw. It was wild. It was demanding, but it was clean. There were no fences here, no brands, no history. This is it, Eli said, reining Ranger in at the crest of the ridge. Nora looked down at the green bowl of the valley. She felt a profound sense of arrival. It is home, she said. They set to work immediately. The autumn was short in the high country, and they had to beat the snow. They felled trees. Eli swinging the axe with a rhythmic power, the sound echoing off the cliffs. Nora stripped the bark and helped him notch the logs. It was back-breaking work. Her belly grew, making her movements slower, but she refused to stop. They argued over where the hearth should go. Eli wanted it on the north wall for heat. Nora wanted it on the east for the light. They compromised and put it in the corner, facing the sunrise. They laughed as they daubed mud and moss between the logs, covering each other in dirt. For the first time in their lives, the work was not for survival alone. It was for creation. They were building a future. By the time the first heavy snow fell, the cabin was tight. It was small, just one room with a loft, but it was solid. They had a stack of firewood as high as the eaves, and the smoke from their chimney rose straight up into the cold. Clear air. Winter in the high valley was a beast. The snow fell for days on end, piling up until it buried the windows. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a banshee trying to tear the roof off. They were pinned inside, isolated from the rest of humanity by miles of white death. The woodpile dwindled faster than they had planned. The flour barrel grew light. One night, a storm hit that was worse than the others. The roof timbers groaned under the weight of the wet snow. The wind sounded like a freight train. Nora sat by the fire, sewing a small shirt from one of her old petticoats. She felt the baby kick, a strong, vigorous thump against her ribs. Suddenly, a wave of black fear washed over her. She dropped the sewing. She looked at the dark window. "What if we are wrong?" she whispered. Eli looked up from whittling a spoon. "Wrong about what? What if the world is too hard?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. "What if we bring this child into a life of struggle? What if someone finds out about me? About us? What if the baby grows up and hears the stories? That his mother was a whore and his father was a killer?" She stood up, pacing the small floor. "We cannot protect him from everything. Eli, the hate is always out there. Waiting." Eli stood up. He walked over to her and took her by the shoulders. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He could feel her shaking. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and rumbling against her ear. He pulled back so he could look into her eyes. "That baby is not going to hear stories about a whore and a killer. That baby is going to hear the truth." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "He is going to know that his mother stood in a courtroom full of men who wanted to destroy her and told them to go to hell. He is going to know that she walked into a burning barn to save a horse. He is going to know that she was braver than any man in that town." Eli's eyes burned with intensity. "We chose love over fear. Nora, that is what we are going to teach him. We do not hide our scars. We show them. We tell him. This is where we survived. This is where we got strong." Nora looked at him. She saw the conviction in his face, the absolute certainty of his love. The fear in her chest began to loosen its grip. "You really believe that?" she whispered. "I have to," Eli said. "It is the only way to live." The storm raged all night, but inside the cabin, the fire held. By morning, the wind had died. Nora woke to a silence so profound it felt like a presence. She climbed out of the warm furs and went to the door. She pushed it open. The world outside was blinding. The valley was a bowl of diamonds. The snow was pristine, untouched, glittering under a sun that blazed from a hard blue sky. The branches of the pines were laden with white, bowing in reverence to the morning. The creek steamed faintly, a ribbon of life cutting through the frost. Eli came up behind her. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and pulled her back against his chest. They stood there in the doorway, watching their kingdom. Eli reached around and rested his hands on her swollen belly, as if in answer. The baby kicked, a long, rolling movement that they both felt. "He is awake," Eli murmured, smiling against her neck. "He is ready," Nora said. And she knew it was true. She was ready. The past was a scar. Yes, but scars were just skin that had grown back tougher. Months later, when the snow had melted into wildflowers that painted the meadow in purple and gold, they sat on the hill above the cabin. It was dusk. The sky was a bruised purple, fading into indigo. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Below them, smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the home they had built with their own hands. Nora sat with her legs stretched out, leaning back against Eli's chest. He sat with his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. They watched the light fade from the peaks. Nora closed her eyes. She remembered the ride across the river. She remembered the terror of the water, the sheer size of the stallion beneath her, and the voice in her ear. Too big. Just sit tight. She smiled. She had thought he was talking about the horse. She had thought he was talking about the river, but as she sat there, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heart against her back, she realized he had been talking about this, about life, about love. It was big. It was terrifying. It was a flood that could drown you if you fought it. But if you trusted, if you held on to the right thing, it would carry you across. She took Eli's hand and pressed it to her lips. This man, this scarred, quiet, dangerous man. He was the vastness she had been afraid of, and he was the anchor she had needed. She looked down at the valley, dark and quiet and free. She was not sitting tight anymore. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Nora and Eli resonated with you as much as it did with me writing it. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. We have many more stories to tell, stories of grit, survival, and the kind of love that can weather any storm. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did Nora make the right choice? What would you have done in her boots? I look forward to reading your words.